She knelt in the dirt like an animal, wrists bleeding, face swollen, soul shattered. Around her, men shouted numbers like she was cattle. Mara Ellington had lost everything: her father, her home, her dignity. And in 30 seconds, she would lose her freedom forever. But then, a stranger walked through the saloon doors. $1,000. 4 words that changed everything. This is the story of how a broken woman and a silent lawman burned down an empire of corruption. Stay until the end and comment your city so I can see how far this story travels. The sun over Santo Vega didn't shine. It punished. July in the New Mexico territory brought a heat so vicious it could kill a man standing still. The kind of heat that made the air shimmer like water, that cracked the earth into jagged scars, that sent rattlesnakes deep into the rocks just to survive. And on this particular afternoon, as the temperature climbed past 100 degrees, the cruelty of the land seemed almost merciful compared to the cruelty of the men gathered in the town square. They called it an auction, but everyone knew what it really was. Mara Ellington knelt on a wooden platform that had been hastily constructed in front of the Silver Spur Saloon. Her wrists were bound behind her back with rough hemp rope that had already rubbed her skin raw. Blood, dried and fresh, caked the corners of her mouth where Sheriff Vernon Barlow had struck her that morning. Her dress, once a modest blue cotton that her father had bought her for her 21st birthday, was now torn at the shoulder and stained with dirt. Her dark hair hung in tangled waves across her face, hiding eyes that had gone empty 3 days ago. 3 days. That was how long it had taken for her entire world to collapse. "Gentlemen," Sheriff Barlow's voice boomed across the square, silencing the murmur of the crowd. He was a thick man, barrel-chested and red-faced, with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. His badge caught the sunlight as he stepped onto the platform beside Mara, and he placed one meaty hand on her shoulder like a rancher displaying a prize heifer. "What we have here is a unique opportunity. A young woman of good health, strong constitution, and—" He paused, letting his gaze crawl over her in a way that made several men in the crowd chuckle. Obvious appeal. Mara didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't give him the satisfaction. She had learned in those 3 days that fighting only made things worse, that screaming only entertained them, that begging only made Sheriff Barlow hit harder. So she knelt in the dirt and the heat and the humiliation, and she let her mind drift somewhere far away, to the ranch, to her father's voice, to the smell of coffee brewing at dawn, and the sound of cattle lowing in the distance. "Now, I know what some of you are thinking," Barlow continued, pacing the platform with theatrical flair. "You're thinking, Sheriff, how can this be legal? How can you sell a white woman like she's property?" He held up a folded document, waving it so the crowd could see the official seal pressed into the paper. "I'll tell you how. Miss Ellington's father, God rest his soul, died owing this town a considerable debt. And according to territorial law, when a man dies without heirs of majority and without the means to settle his accounts, his remaining property, including any unmarried daughters, falls to the jurisdiction of the local authority for dispensation." It was a lie. Every word of it was a lie. Mara's father, Thomas Ellington, had been one of the most successful ranchers in the territory. His spread, the Double Star Ranch, covered nearly 3,000 acres of prime grazing land, with water rights to Coyote Creek and a herd of over 500 head. He had been healthy, prosperous, and beloved by everyone who knew him, until 6 months ago. That was when the trouble started. First it was the bank, suddenly claiming that Thomas had taken out loans he'd never heard of. Then it was the cattle, 300 head vanishing in a single night, rustled by men who left no tracks. Then it was the water. Someone had dammed Coyote Creek upstream, turning the pastures to dust. And then 3 weeks ago, Thomas Ellington was found dead in his own barn. Heart failure, the doctor had proclaimed, a doctor who arrived from Santa Fe the day before and left the day after, and who no one in town had ever seen before or since. Mara knew the truth. Her father had been murdered, and now the same men who had killed him were about to sell her like livestock. "Let's start the bidding at $50, Barlow announced, his voice cutting through the oppressive heat. "Do I hear 50? A hand shot up near the back of the crowd. 50! Mara recognized the voice. It belonged to Cornelius Drake, the owner of the territory's largest mining operation, a man known for working his laborers to death and for keeping a rotation of domestic servants in his private quarters, servants who, according to whispered rumors, rarely lasted more than a few months before being replaced. 50 to Mr. Drake. Do I hear 60? 60. Another voice. This one belonging to a cattle baron named Whitmore, who had 3 wives buried in the cemetery and a 4th who rarely left the house without bruises. 70. Drake again, his voice sharp with irritation. 80. 100. The numbers climbed, and with each bid, Mara felt another piece of herself crumble away. She had always believed, perhaps naively, that there were limits to what men would do, that somewhere, somehow, decency would prevail, that someone would stand up and say, "This is wrong." But no one did. The crowd pressed closer, eager and hungry, their faces blurred into a mass of leering eyes and open mouths. Some were miners, their hands blackened with ore dust. Some were ranchers, their boots caked with mud. Some were townsmen, shopkeepers and clerks and ordinary citizens who had known her father, who had tipped their hats to her on the street, who had called her Miss Mara, with smiles that now seemed like masks hiding something rotten underneath. 200! Whitmore shouted, his face flushed with competitive fury. 250, Drake countered. They were fighting over her like dogs over a bone. And all around them men were laughing, joking, placing side bets on who would win. Mara closed her eyes. "Father," she thought, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I couldn't save the ranch. I'm sorry I couldn't find proof of what they did to you. I'm sorry I wasn't stronger. 300. 350. If there's any justice in this world, any God watching from above, please, please let this end. $400, final offer." Drake's voice cracked with desperation. He was not a man accustomed to being outbid. Sheriff Barlow grinned, clearly enjoying the spectacle. 400 to Mr. Drake. Going once? Going twice? The saloon doors creaked open. At first, no one noticed. The crowd was too focused on the platform, too caught up in the frenzy of the auction. But then a ripple of silence began to spread from the back of the gathering, moving forward like a wave, until even Sheriff Barlow paused mid-sentence. A man stood in the doorway of the Silver Spur. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and a lean, weathered frame that spoke of years spent under open skies. His clothes were simple: black boots, dust-covered trousers, a dark shirt buttoned to the collar, and a long coat that hung past his knees. His hat was pulled low, casting his face in shadow, but even without seeing his features, there was something about him that commanded attention. Something dangerous. Something still. The crowd parted as he walked forward, his boot heels making no sound on the packed dirt. He moved like a man who had all the time in the world, unhurried, unafraid, utterly certain of his place in it. When he reached the front of the gathering, he stopped. For a long moment, he simply looked at the platform, at Sheriff Barlow's sweating face, at the wooden block where Mara knelt, at the rope cutting into her wrists, and the blood dried on her lips. Then he spoke. $1,000. His voice was quiet. Not soft, there was nothing soft about it, but quiet, the way thunder is quiet in the moment before it breaks. The crowd went absolutely silent. Sheriff Barlow recovered first, though his smile had become fixed and brittle. "I'm sorry, stranger, but I don't believe I caught your name." The man reached up and pushed his hat back slightly, revealing a face that was neither handsome nor ugly, just hard. Hard like stone, hard like the desert, hard like a life spent doing things that left marks on a man's soul. His eyes were pale gray, almost colorless, and they fixed on Barlow with an intensity that made the sheriff take an involuntary step backward. "Name's Gage Thorne," the stranger said, "Marshal of Red Bluff, and I believe I just made a bid." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Marshal. The word carried weight, federal authority that superseded any local sheriff's jurisdiction. Barlow's face went from red to white in the space of a heartbeat. "Now, Marshal," he said, his voice losing some of its boom, "this is a perfectly legal proceeding under territorial law. I have documentation." "I'm sure you do." Thorne reached into his coat, and for one tense moment, every man in the crowd wondered if he was going for a gun. Instead, He produced a leather wallet and counted out bills with deliberate slowness. $1,000, cash money. I believe that concludes the auction. Drake pushed forward, his face purple with rage. Now see here, you can't just... Thorne's eyes shifted to him, and Drake's voice died in his throat. The Marshal hadn't moved, hadn't reached for a weapon, hadn't even changed his expression. But something in that pale gaze made the mining baron suddenly remember an urgent appointment elsewhere. Unless, Thorne said softly, someone wants to bid higher? Silence. Complete, absolute silence. Even the wind seemed to have stopped, leaving the town square suspended in a moment of crystalline tension. Sheriff Barlow looked at the money in Thorne's hand, looked at the badge glinting beneath his coat, looked at the faces of the crowd, men who, moments ago, had been eager participants in his little enterprise, but who now seemed very interested in studying their boots. He was trapped, and he knew it. Sold, Barlow said through gritted teeth, to Marshal Thorne. The crowd dispersed quickly after that, too quickly, like rats fleeing a sinking ship. Within minutes, the square was empty except for Thorne, Barlow, and Mara still kneeling on the platform. Thorne climbed the wooden steps slowly, his eyes never leaving the sheriff. When he reached Mara, he crouched down beside her, and for the first time she got a clear look at his face. He was perhaps 40, though the lines around his eyes suggested he'd lived twice that in hard years. His jaw was shadowed with several days' worth of stubble, and there was a thin scar running from his left temple to the corner of his mouth. Old, faded, but still visible. But it was his eyes that held her attention. Those strange, pale eyes that seemed to see straight through her to something underneath. You hurt bad? His voice was different now, still quiet, but without the edge of warning that had silenced the crowd. Mara tried to answer, but her throat had gone dry. She hadn't spoken in 3 days, not since Barlow had backhanded her for screaming when they dragged her from her father's grave. Thorne seemed to understand. Without another word, he reached behind her and began working at the knots binding her wrists. His hands were large and calloused, but surprisingly gentle. Those ropes are the property of... Barlow began. Shut up. The sheriff's mouth snapped closed. The rope fell away and Mara gasped as blood rushed back into her hands. The pain was extraordinary, pins and needles multiplied by 1,000, shooting up her arms like fire. She cradled her wrists against her chest, tears streaming down her face despite her determination not to cry. Thorne stood and extended a hand. She looked at it, at the scars across his knuckles, the dirt beneath his nails, the steady, unwavering offer. Then she looked up at his face. Why? It was barely a whisper, scraped raw from her throat. Thorne didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced at Barlow, a look that contained a promise, a threat, and a warning all at once, before turning back to Mara. Because no one else was going to. She took his hand. Bob. He led her through the back streets of Santo Vega, avoiding the main thoroughfares where curious eyes might follow. His horse, a tall black gelding with a white blaze on its forehead, was tied behind the livery stable, along with a pack mule loaded with supplies. Can you ride? Thorne asked as he checked the cinches on the horse's saddle. Mara nodded. She had grown up on horseback, had been riding almost before she could walk. Her legs felt weak, her head was spinning from heat and hunger, but she could ride. Good. We need to put distance between us and this town before nightfall. He swung up into the saddle and extended his hand again. You'll ride with me until we can find you a mount of your own. She hesitated. Where are we going? North, to Red Bluff. You'll be safe there. Safe. The word felt foreign on her tongue, like a language she'd forgotten how to speak. Thorne's expression softened almost imperceptibly. I know you have no reason to trust me. I know you've just been through hell, but I'm asking you to believe me when I say... He paused, choosing his words carefully. I didn't just buy you, Miss Ellington. I'm not taking you from one prison to another. I'm taking you somewhere you can heal, somewhere you can decide what happens next. How do you know my name? I know a lot of things. He held her gaze steadily. I knew your father. The words hit her like a physical blow. She staggered backward, would have fallen if Thorne hadn't reached down and caught her arm. Easy. Easy now. I'll explain everything. I promise. But not here. Not where they can hear us. As if to punctuate his words, a door slammed somewhere in the distance, followed by raised voices. The town was waking up from its shock, and soon questions would turn to action. Mara looked back at Santo Vega, at the dusty streets where she had walked as a child, at the church where she had been baptized, at the cemetery where her father lay in an unmarked grave because no one would help her buy a headstone. Then she looked at the stranger who had paid $1,000 to cut her ropes. She took his hand and let him pull her up onto the horse. They rode north as the sun began its long descent toward the western mountains, casting the desert in shades of orange and gold and deep, bruised purple. Thorn kept the horse at a steady pace, fast enough to cover ground, slow enough not to exhaust the animal. The pack mule followed behind, its hooves raising small clouds of dust that hung in the still air. Mara sat in front of Thorn, her body rigid with tension despite her exhaustion. She could feel the heat of him at her back, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the way his arms bracketed her as he held the reins. It should have felt threatening, this stranger's body so close to hers, but somehow it didn't. Somehow, against all reason, she felt secure. They didn't speak for the first hour. The desert rolled past in waves of sagebrush and red rock, broken occasionally by the skeleton of a dead cottonwood or the flash of a jackrabbit darting for cover. Hawks circled overhead, riding the thermals, their shadows sliding across the earth like dark omens. Finally, when Santo Vega had disappeared completely behind them and the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, Thorn spoke. "There's a canyon about 2 miles ahead. Good water, good cover. We'll make camp there for the night." Mara nodded, but said nothing. "There's food in the pack," he continued. "Beans, hardtack, some dried beef. Not much, but enough to get your strength back." Still nothing. Thorn was quiet for a moment, then, "You don't have to talk if you don't want to. I understand, but if you have questions about me, about what just happened, about what comes next, I'll answer them. No secrets. Not with you." Something in his voice, a note of genuine honesty that cut through the numbness surrounding her, made Mara finally turn her head to look at him. "You said you knew my father." "I did." "How?" "It's a long story." "We have time." A ghost of a smile crossed Thorn's weathered face. "Fair enough." He adjusted the reins slightly, guiding the horse around a patch of loose rock. "I met Thomas Ellington 15 years ago in a mining town called Copper Ridge up in Colorado. He was running cattle through the territory and I was a different man then. Younger, angrier, looking for trouble and usually finding it." "You were an outlaw?" "No, but I wasn't always a lawman either. I was something in between, a hired gun mostly, working for whoever paid the most." He paused, his jaw tightening. "I'm not proud of those years. Did things I can't take back. But your father—" He shook his head slowly. "Your father saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself. Gave me a job on his cattle drive when no one else would. Treated me like a man instead of a weapon. And when I finally got my head on straight, when I decided to pin on a badge and try to do some good in this world, he was the one who wrote the letter of recommendation that got me my first posting." Mara absorbed this in silence. She had known her father was kind, had seen it in the way he treated his workers, in the gentle patience he showed the horses, in the stories he told her every night before bed. But she had never known this. Never known that his kindness had reached a stranger in a mining town and helped shape him into something better. "When did you last see him?" she asked. 2 years ago. I stopped by the Double Star on my way to take up the position in Red Bluff. We sat on his porch, drank whiskey, talked about the old days." Thorn's voice grew heavy. "He told me about you, said you were the best thing that ever happened to him, said he worried about leaving you alone in this world because he knew—" He stopped abruptly. "Knew what?" "Nothing. It doesn't matter now." "Tell me." Mara's voice was stronger now, sharpened by something that might have been anger. "You said no secrets." Thorn was silent for a long moment. Then he sighed, a sound of resignation. He knew someone was coming for him. Didn't know who exactly, but he knew. Said he'd made enemies, powerful enemies, by refusing to sell his land to the mining consortium. Said they'd tried to buy him out half a dozen times, and when he wouldn't budge, the threats started. Letters. Dead animals left on his property, shots fired in the night. Mara's hands clenched into fists. Why didn't he tell anyone? Why didn't he come to you? He didn't want to involve anyone else. Thought he could handle it on his own. Thorne's voice was bitter now, edged with old grief. Stubborn fool. I told him to write if things got worse. Told him I'd come running no matter what. But the next letter I got wasn't from Thomas. It was from a lawyer in Santa Fe, telling me he was dead. And that's when you came. That's when I came. Took me 3 weeks to get here. Had to close out some business in Red Bluff first, make sure my deputies could handle things while I was gone. By the time I arrived, you were already... He trailed off. Already being sold. Mara's voice was flat, empty. I'm sorry. The words were inadequate. They both knew it, but they were sincere. If I'd been faster, you came. She turned to look at him again, and this time there were tears on her cheeks, though her expression remained hard. That's more than anyone else did. They reached the canyon as full dark settled over the desert. It was a narrow cut in the red rock, protected on 3 sides by sheer walls that rose 20 feet into the star-filled sky. A thin stream trickled along the bottom, fed by some underground spring, and a cluster of juniper trees provided cover from any eyes that might be watching from above. Thorne helped Mara down from the horse, then went about the business of making camp with the efficiency of long practice. He gathered wood for a fire, unpacked supplies from the mule, spread a bedroll in the most sheltered spot. Here, he handed her a canteen. Drink slowly. Your body's been through a lot. The water was warm and tasted of leather, but to Mara it was the sweetest thing she had ever experienced. She drank, fighting the urge to gulp, while Thorne heated a can of beans over the small fire. Can I ask you something? She said when her throat felt human again. Anything. That money, the $1,000, where did it come from? Thorne's expression flickered, just for a moment, but Mara caught it. Does it matter? It matters to me. He was silent for a long moment, stirring the beans with a wooden spoon. Finally, he said, It was my savings. 15 years worth. Everything I had. Mara stared at him. Everything? Every cent. But why? You didn't even know me. You could have ridden past Santo Vega without stopping, could have pretended you never saw that auction, could have let them sell you like an animal. Thorne's voice was sharp now, cutting. Could have watched while they destroyed the daughter of the only man who ever believed in me. He met her eyes, and there was something fierce burning in those pale depths. No, I couldn't have. The fire crackled between them, sending shadows dancing across the canyon walls. Besides, Thorne added, his voice softening, money can be earned again. Some things can't be replaced. Mara didn't know how to respond to that. Didn't know what to do with the storm of emotions, gratitude, confusion, grief, something else she couldn't name, that was building inside her chest. So instead, she asked another question. What happens now? Thorne handed her a tin plate of beans. Now, you eat, then you sleep. Tomorrow, we keep riding north. And somewhere along the way, we figure out who killed your father and how we're going to make them pay. We? We. He met her eyes steadily. You're not alone in this anymore, Miss Ellington. I made a promise to myself when I saw you on that platform. A promise that I would see this through to the end, no matter what it takes. Your father's death won't go unanswered. The men who did this to you won't go unpunished. And you? He paused, something softening in his weathered face. You're going to get your life back, I swear it. Mara looked at this stranger, this silent, scarred lawman who had given everything he had to cut her ropes, and felt something shift inside her. Something that had been frozen for 3 days began, very slowly, to thaw. Mara, she said quietly. What? My name. It's Mara, not Miss Ellington. Thorne nodded slowly. Mara. She ate her beans in silence after that, watching the stars wheel overhead and listening to the soft sounds of the desert night. And when exhaustion finally claimed her, and she lay down on the bedroll Thorne had prepared, she found herself slipping toward sleep faster than she would have thought possible. The last thing she saw before darkness took her was Thorne's silhouette against the dying fire, sitting upright, rifle across his knees, keeping watch over her through the long hours of the night. Morning came slowly to the canyon, the sun taking its time to climb over the eastern walls and chase away the shadows. Mara woke to the smell of coffee brewing and the sound of Thorn moving quietly around the camp. She lay still for a moment, her mind struggling to reconcile the events of the past few days. Part of her still expected to wake up in her own bed at the Double Star, to hear her father's footsteps in the hallway, to discover that everything, the death, the auction, the stranger, had been nothing but a terrible dream. But the ache in her wrists was real. The split in her lip was real. And when she opened her eyes, the red rock walls of the canyon were undeniably, inescapably real. "Coffee's ready." Thorn's voice, quiet and steady. She sat up, wincing at the stiffness in her muscles, and accepted the tin cup he handed her. The coffee was strong and bitter, but it cleared the fog from her mind and put warmth back into her bones. "How do you feel?" Thorn asked. Thorn tiet. Mara considered the question. "Alive," she said finally. "I feel alive." It seemed to be the right answer. Thorn nodded, a hint of approval in his expression. "We should talk," he said, settling onto a rock across from her. "About what happened. About what comes next." "I'm listening." Thorn reached into his coat and pulled out a worn leather journal. "I've been investigating your father's death since I arrived in the territory. Talked to people, followed leads, pieced together what I could. And what I found—" He shook his head slowly. "It's bigger than I thought. Much bigger." "Tell me." "Your father wasn't the first rancher to die under suspicious circumstances. Over the past 2 years, at least 8 other landowners in the territory have met similar ends: heart failure, riding accidents, snake bites, all manner of convenient deaths. And every single one of them had something in common. They owned land that the Santo Vega Mining Consortium wanted." Mara's hands tightened around her coffee cup. "The consortium? That's Cornelius Drake's company. Drake's the public face, but he's not the one pulling the strings. The real power behind the consortium is a man named Judge Harold Whitmore." "Whitmore?" Mara's voice rose with shock. "The cattle baron?" "The cattle baron is his brother. The judge operates out of Santa Fe, but his reach extends across the entire territory. He's got politicians, lawmen, bankers all in his pocket. He finds land he wants, manufactures debts and legal claims, and when the owners won't sell—" Thorn's jaw tightened. "He makes them disappear." "And Sheriff Barlow?" "One of Whitmore's men. Has been for years. He handles the local arrangements." Mara's mind was racing, trying to process this flood of information. "If what you're saying is true, then the documents, the debt papers Barlow showed at the auction, forgeries, every one of them." "And my father's death certificate?" "Also forged. I got a look at it before I rode into Santo Vega. The doctor who signed it doesn't exist, at least not in any medical registry I could find." Something cold and hard was forming in Mara's chest. Not grief, she had moved beyond grief now, but something sharper, something that burned. "How do we prove it?" she asked. "How do we bring them down?" Thorn leaned forward, his pale eyes intent. "That's where you come in." "Me?" "Your father was a careful man, meticulous. He kept records of everything, every transaction, every letter, every threat. If those records still exist, they could blow this whole conspiracy wide open." "They exist." Mara's voice was quiet but certain. "He had a hiding place. A secret room beneath the barn where he kept his most important documents. He showed it to me when I was 16, made me promise never to tell anyone, said it was our insurance in case anything ever happened." Thorn sat back, something like hope flickering across his face. "Do you think the documents are still there?" "I don't know. After Father died, Barlow's men ransacked the house, took everything they could find. But they never found the hidden room. No one knew about it except me." "Then we have a chance." Thorn stood, his movement suddenly charged with purpose. "If we can get those documents, get them to the right people, federal marshals, territorial judges, outside of Whitmore's influence, we can bring the whole operation crashing down. But the ranch is under Barlow's control now. They'll have men guarding it. Then we'll go at night, slip in, get what we need, slip out before they know we're there." Mara rose to her feet, her exhaustion forgotten. When? Not yet. First, we need to get you somewhere safe. Red Bluff, where my deputies can protect you while I make arrangements. Then, when the time is right, we'll go back for those documents. No. Thorne's eyebrows rose. No? I'm not going to hide in Red Bluff while you risk your life for my father's papers. Mara met his gaze steadily, her bruised face set with determination. This is my fight, my father, my ranch. I'm going with you. It'll be dangerous. I don't care. You could be killed. I was already sold like a piece of furniture. I was already beaten and humiliated and stripped of everything that made me human. Her voice was rising now, cracking with emotion she had kept bottled for too long. They took my father. They took my home. They took my dignity. I will not let them take my revenge. Thorne studied her for a long moment, this young woman with fire in her eyes and blood on her lips, standing in a desert canyon with nothing left to lose. Then, slowly, he nodded. All right, he said. We do this together. They broke camp as the sun climbed higher, erasing the shadows from the canyon floor. Thorne found a second horse in a small rancher's homestead 20 miles north, paid for it with the last of his pocket money, leaving himself with nothing but the clothes on his back and the weapons at his side. Mara rode her own mount now, a sturdy bay mare with gentle eyes and a steady gait. The animal seemed to sense her mood, responding to the slightest pressure of her knees, carrying her forward without complaint. They traveled for 3 days, skirting the main trails and avoiding the towns where Barlow's influence might reach. Thorne knew the territory well, knew which canyons offered shelter, which springs held water, which passes were watched, and which were forgotten. He moved through the landscape like a ghost, leaving no trace of their passage for pursuers to follow. At night, they made small fires in hidden places and talked. Mara found herself opening up to this strange lawman in ways she hadn't expected. She told him about her childhood on the Double Star, about learning to ride before she could read, about helping her father with the cattle drives, about the wild joy of galloping across open range with the wind in her hair and nothing but sky above. She told him about her mother, who had died when Mara was 7, a fever that swept through the territory and left 100 graves in its wake. She told him about the years afterward, when it was just her and her father against the world, building something good out of sweat and determination. And she told him about the last 6 months, the creeping terror, the sleepless nights, the growing certainty that something terrible was coming. In return, Thorne told her about his own past. He had been born in Kansas, the son of a preacher who believed that sparing the rod meant spoiling the child. His childhood had been a series of beatings and Bible verses, of cold rooms and colder silences. He had run away at 15, fallen in with outlaws at 17, and spent the next decade drifting through the West like a tumbleweed in a storm. I wasn't a good man, he said one night, his voice rough with old shame. I hurt people. Not always with guns, sometimes just with my presence, my indifference, my willingness to look the other way while wrong things happened. I told myself it didn't matter, that the world was cruel and I was just surviving in it. But that was a lie. It always mattered. What changed? Mara asked. Thorne was quiet for a long moment. Your father, he said finally. He didn't preach at me like mine did, didn't lecture or condemn. He just treated me like a person, like someone who had value beyond what I could do with a gun. His voice grew thick. And I realized that if a man like Thomas Ellington could see something worth saving in me, then maybe, just maybe, it was actually there. Mara reached across the fire and laid her hand on his. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them needed to. Done. On the 4th day, they reached the outskirts of Red Bluff, a small but prosperous mining town nestled in a valley between 2 mountain ranges. Unlike Santo Vega, which had felt rotten from the inside out, Red Bluff seemed clean and well kept. The streets were wide and orderly, the buildings freshly painted, the people walking with the easy confidence of citizens who knew their laws were enforced fairly. Home, Thorne said, a rare note of warmth in his voice. It's beautiful, Mara admitted. It is. And more importantly, it's safe. Whitmore's reach doesn't extend here, not yet anyway. My deputies are good men, and the town council is honest. You can rest here, recover your strength, while we Mara corrected. Thorne sighed, but there was a hint of amusement in it. While we make plans. They rode into town as the sun was setting, painting the mountain peaks in shades of gold and rose. People stopped on the sidewalks to watch them pass, curious glances that lingered on Mara's bruised face and torn dress before shifting to Thorne with something like recognition. "Marshal, you're back!" A young man in deputy's clothes came running from the sheriff's office, his face split with a grin. "We weren't expecting you for another week." "Change of plans, Billy." Thorne swung down from his horse. "Get Doc Harrison. Tell him I've got a patient who needs looking at." Billy's grin faded as he got a closer look at Mara. "What happened to her?" "Long story. Just get the doc." "Yes, sir." The deputy took off at a run. Thorne helped Mara down from her horse, keeping a steadying hand on her arm as they walked toward the office. "There's a room in the back," he said. "Clean bed, hot water, and no one will bother you until you're ready." "Marshal Thorne." Mara stopped just inside the doorway, turning to face him. "I never thanked you properly for what you did. For what you're doing." Thorne's weathered face softened. "You don't have to thank me." "Yes, I do." She held his gaze steadily. "You gave up everything, your savings, your safety, your peace, for a woman you'd never met. That's not nothing. That's—" She struggled to find the words. "That's more than anyone has ever done for me. Your father would have done the same." "My father is dead." Her voice cracked slightly, but she pushed through. "You're alive. And you chose to stand up when everyone else sat down. That matters. It matters more than I can say." Thorne was silent for a long moment. Then, very slowly, he reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her face, a gesture so gentle, so careful, that it made Mara's breath catch in her throat. "Get some rest," he said quietly. "Tomorrow, we start planning, and when we're done—" His eyes hardened with promise. "The men who destroyed your world are going to answer for what they did. Every last one of them." Mara nodded, tears pricking at her eyes for the first time since she'd knelt on that auction block. But these were different tears. These were the tears of someone who had found, against all odds, a reason to hope. The doc came and went, cleaning her wounds and pronouncing her battered but unbroken. She slept for 14 hours straight, sinking into the clean sheets like a stone dropping into deep water. When she woke, sunlight was streaming through the window, and she could hear voices in the outer office, Thorne conferring with his deputies, discussing routes and timetables and the disposition of Barlow's forces. Mara lay still for a moment, feeling the warmth of the bed around her, the softness of the pillow beneath her head. For the first time in weeks, she didn't feel afraid. For the first time in weeks, she felt like herself. Not the broken girl on the auction block, but Mara Ellington, daughter of Thomas Ellington, rancher and survivor and woman with fire in her veins. They had taken so much from her, but they hadn't taken everything. They hadn't taken her will. They hadn't taken her memory. And they hadn't taken her hunger for justice. She rose from the bed, wincing at the lingering aches in her muscles, and walked to the window. Outside, Red Bluff was coming to life. Shopkeepers opening their doors, children running to school, miners heading up the mountain with their picks over their shoulders. It was a good town, an honest town, the kind of town her father had dreamed of building on the Double Star. "I'm going to get it back," she thought fiercely. "I'm going to get it all back. And the men who killed you, the men who sold me like livestock, they're going to pay." She didn't know how, she didn't know when, but standing there in the morning light, watching the peaceful streets of Red Bluff and thinking of the documents hidden beneath her father's barn, Mara Ellington made herself a promise. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. The days in Red Bluff passed slowly, each one bleeding into the next like watercolors on wet paper. Mara spent the first week doing little more than sleeping and eating, her body demanding rest with an urgency that surprised her. She hadn't realized how close to breaking she had been until she finally stopped running. Doc Harrison came by every morning to check her wounds, clucking his tongue at the rope burns on her wrists and shaking his head at the fading bruises on her face. He was a kind man, silver-haired and soft-spoken, with hands that moved with the gentle precision of someone who had spent a lifetime mending broken things. "You're healing well," he told her on the 7th day, unwrapping the bandages from her wrists to examine the raw skin beneath. "The scarring will be minimal if you keep them clean and let them breathe." Mara looked down at her wrists, at the angry red lines that circled them like bracelets of shame. Will they fade completely? Doc Harrison hesitated, and in that hesitation she found her answer. Some marks, he said carefully, become part of who we are. That doesn't make them weaknesses. Sometimes it makes them reminders of what we survived. After he left, Mara stood at the window of her small room, watching the street below. Red Bluff was waking up, as it did every morning, with the easy rhythm of a town that knew its own heartbeat. Shopkeepers swept their porches. Children chased each other down the wooden sidewalks. A dog barked somewhere in the distance, answered by another, and then another, until the whole valley seemed to ring with the sound of ordinary life. It was beautiful, and it was foreign. She had grown up in a world of wide-open spaces and endless horizons, where the nearest neighbor was a day's ride away, and the only sounds at night were the wind and the coyotes, and her father's voice reading aloud from his worn copy of Shakespeare. She had never lived in a town, never walked on wooden sidewalks, never woken to the clatter of commerce and conversation. It should have felt liberating, this bustling little community where no one knew her shame, where she could start fresh and become whoever she wanted to be. Instead, it felt like exile. A knock at her door pulled her from her thoughts. She turned to find Gage Thorne standing in the doorway, his hat in his hands, looking almost uncertain for the first time since she'd met him. "May I come in?" She nodded, and he stepped inside, closing the door behind him with a soft click. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Better, stronger." She paused, restless. A hint of a smile crossed his weathered face. "I figured as much. You've been cooped up in here for a week. Thought you might want to get some fresh air." "Where?" "There's a place I want to show you, up in the mountains. It's a bit of a ride, but—" He shrugged, a gesture that seemed almost boyish on a man so hardened. "I think you'll like it." Mara hesitated. The thought of leaving the safety of Red Bluff, even for a few hours, made something tighten in her chest. But staying in this room, staring at these walls, replaying the same dark memories over and over, that was its own kind of prison. "All right," she said, "let me get my boots." They rode out of town as the sun climbed toward its midday peak, following a narrow trail that wound up into the foothills. Thorne led the way on his black gelding, and Mara followed on the bay mare that had become hers by default, the animal responding to her touch with the easy trust of a creature that had never known cruelty. The landscape changed as they climbed, the scrubby desert giving way to pine forests and granite outcroppings that jutted from the earth like the bones of ancient giants. The air grew cooler, thinner, carrying the scent of sap and wildflowers, and the distant promise of snow. They didn't speak much, but the silence between them had lost its awkwardness. It was the silence of two people who had nothing to prove to each other, comfortable, companionable, almost intimate in its ease. After nearly 2 hours of riding, Thorne reined in his horse at the edge of a small clearing. Beyond the trees, the ground dropped away sharply, revealing a vista that took Mara's breath away. The valley of Red Bluff spread out below them like a painting, the town itself nothing more than a cluster of toy-like buildings nestled among the green. Beyond it, the desert stretched to the horizon in waves of gold and brown, broken by the dark lines of distant mountains. And above it all, the sky arched in an infinite dome of blue, unmarked by a single cloud. "This is where I come when I need to think," Thorne said quietly, swinging down from his horse. "When the world gets too loud and I need to remember what really matters." Mara dismounted beside him, her eyes still fixed on the panorama before her. "It's beautiful." "It is." He stood beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him through her sleeve. "My first week in Red Bluff, I thought I'd made a mistake. Thought I'd traded one prison for another. Smaller, maybe, but just as confining. Then I found this place, and I realized—" He paused, searching for words. "I realized that freedom isn't about having no walls. It's about knowing you can always find your way back to the sky." She turned to look at him, really look at him, for the first time since they'd left town. The sunlight caught the angles of his face, softening the hard lines, revealing the man beneath the Marshal's badge and the gunfighter's reputation. "You're not what I expected," she said. His eyebrows rose. "What did you expect?" "I don't know. Someone harder, maybe. Someone who saw the world in black and white. She shook her head slowly. You're not like that. The world isn't like that. Anyone who tells you different is either lying or hasn't lived long enough to know better. They stood in silence for a long moment, watching a hawk circle lazily in the updrafts, its shadow sliding across the valley floor far below. Tell me about the plan, Mara said finally. Thorne's expression shifted, the softness giving way to something more focused. You sure you want to do this now? We came up here to get away from all that. I came up here because I couldn't stand staring at those walls anymore, but that doesn't mean I've forgotten why I'm here. She met his gaze steadily. My father is dead. The men who killed him are still breathing, and somewhere in that ranch is the proof we need to bring them down. I want to know how we're going to get it. Thorne studied her for a long moment, something like respect flickering in his pale eyes. Then he nodded. All right, here's what we know. He moved to a flat rock and sat down, pulling a folded map from his coat pocket and spreading it across his knees. The Double Star Ranch sits about 40 miles south of here, in the foothills below Santo Vega. Barlow's got men stationed there, at least half a dozen, maybe more. They're using it as a base of operations for the consortium's cattle rustling ring. Cattle rustling? That's how they finance the land grabs. They steal cattle from the ranches they're targeting, sell them across the border, use the profits to pay off corrupt officials, and buy more legal muscle. Your father's herd was one of the biggest they ever took. Mara's jaw tightened. 300 head. They vanished in a single night. And ended up in Mexico within a week, sold to a buyer who didn't ask questions. Thorne traced a line on the map with his finger. The point is, the ranch isn't unguarded. We can't just ride in and start searching. So what do? We wait for the right moment. Next week, Judge Whitmore is hosting a gathering at his estate in Santa Fe, a conference of territorial landowners and mining executives. Everyone who's anyone in the consortium will be there, including Barlow and most of his deputies. Leaving the ranch undefended. Lightly defended, Thorne corrected. They'll leave a skeleton crew behind, 2 men, maybe 3. Enough to discourage casual trespassers, but not enough to stop us. Mara leaned forward, studying the map. How do we get in? There's a back route, through the canyons to the east. Your father showed it to me years ago, said it was his escape path in case of Indian raids. It comes out less than a mile from the main house. I know it. Mara's voice was soft with memory. He took me that way once when I was 12, made me memorize every twist and turn. Then you can guide us. Thorne folded the map and tucked it back into his coat. We'll travel light, just the 2 of us and 1 pack horse. Move at night, rest during the day, stay off the main trails. If everything goes according to plan, we'll be in and out before anyone knows we were there. And if it doesn't go according to plan? Thorne's expression hardened. Then we adapt, survive, and finish the job no matter what it takes. Mara was quiet for a long moment, processing everything he'd told her. The risks were enormous. She understood that clearly. If they were caught, there would be no trial, no mercy, no second chances. Barlow and his men would kill them and bury them in the desert, and no one would ever know what had happened. But the alternative was worse. The alternative was letting her father's murderers walk free while she hid in Red Bluff, like a frightened child, waiting for a rescue that would never come. When do we leave? She asked. 3 days. That gives us time to prepare, and puts us at the ranch the night of Whitmore's gathering. Then we should get back to town. There's a lot to do. Thorne nodded, but he didn't move to stand. Instead, he looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Can I ask you something? He said. Of course. Why didn't you give up? The question caught her off guard. What do you mean? On that platform in Santo Vega, when they were bidding on you like you were a piece of furniture. His voice was quiet, probing. Most people would have broken by then, would have shut down, retreated inside themselves, accepted their fate. But you didn't. You were still fighting. I could see it in your eyes. Mara turned away, looking out over the valley as she considered her answer. My mother died when I was 7, she said finally. It was a fever, one of those things that comes out of nowhere and takes everything you love in the space of a week. I remember sitting by her bed, holding her hand, watching her slip away. And I remember thinking, her voice caught, and she had to pause before continuing. I remember thinking that I would never feel pain like that again, that nothing could ever hurt as much as losing her. But your father's death did. No. She shook her head slowly. My father's death was different. It hurt. God knows it hurt. But it wasn't the same. Because when my mother died, I was helpless. I was a child. There was nothing I could do. She turned back to face him, and her eyes were blazing. When my father died, I wasn't helpless anymore. I was a grown woman. And even when they beat me, even when they dragged me to that platform and put me on my knees in front of those vultures, I knew that I still had a choice. I could break, or I could survive. I could accept what they were doing to me, or I could fight with every breath in my body until I couldn't fight anymore. Thorn was silent, watching her. You want to know why I didn't give up? Mara took a step closer to him, her voice dropping to barely more than a whisper. Because giving up means they win, and I will never, never let them win. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The wind rustled through the pine trees around them, carrying the scent of wildflowers and the distant cry of the circling hawk. Then Thorn stood, and there was something new in his expression, something that might have been admiration or understanding, or perhaps something deeper still. Your father was right about you, he said quietly. What did he say? He said you had iron in your spine, said you were the strongest person he'd ever known, and that if anything ever happened to him, you'd be the one to carry on. Thorn's voice roughened with emotion. He was proud of you, Mara. More proud than I think you know. The tears came then, hot and sudden and completely unexpected. Mara tried to blink them back, tried to maintain the composure she'd been clinging to for so long, but they fell anyway, tracing wet lines down her bruised cheeks. Thorn didn't say anything. He simply stepped forward and wrapped his arms around her, pulling her against his chest in an embrace that was neither romantic nor paternal, but something else entirely. The embrace of one survivor to another, two souls who had been broken by the world and were slowly learning to put themselves back together. She cried into his shirt, her shoulders shaking with sobs she had been holding back for weeks. She cried for her father, for her mother, for the life she had lost and the future that had been stolen from her. She cried for the girl on the auction block and the woman she was becoming, for the fear that still lurked in the shadows of her mind and the rage that burned like fire in her heart. And when the tears finally stopped, when she lifted her head and stepped back to look at Thorn through swollen eyes, she felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. She felt clean. Thank you, she whispered. For what? For seeing me. Not the victim. Not the damaged girl. Just me. Thorn's hand came up to cup her cheek, his rough thumb brushing away the last of her tears with impossible gentleness. That's all I've ever seen, he said. The ride back to Red Bluff was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than before. Something had shifted between them on that mountain overlook. Some invisible barrier had crumbled, allowing them to exist in each other's presence with a new kind of ease. Mara found herself watching Thorn as they rode, studying the way he moved in the saddle, the way his eyes constantly scanned the terrain around them, the way his hand rested near his holstered pistol with the casual readiness of a man who had faced danger so many times it had become second nature. He was not handsome, not in the conventional sense. His face was too weathered, too marked by the years, too full of hard angles and old scars. But there was something compelling about him nonetheless, something that drew her eye and held it. It wasn't until they were nearly back to town that she realized what it was. He made her feel safe. Not in the way her father had made her feel safe. That had been the safety of childhood, of innocence, of not yet knowing how cruel the world could be. This was different. This was the safety of a woman who knew exactly how dangerous the world was, and who had found someone willing to stand between her and that danger. It was a strange feeling after everything she'd been through, strange and unexpected and almost frightening in its intensity. But she didn't push it away. Instead, she held on to it like a lifeline in a storm, knowing that in the days ahead, she would need every source of strength she could find. The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparation. Thorn gathered supplies, ammunition, rations, medical supplies, rope, tools, loading them onto a sturdy pack mule that Billy had procured from a local rancher. Mara spent her time poring over maps of the territory, committing every trail and landmark to memory, refreshing her knowledge of the route through the eastern canyons. In the evenings, they ate dinner together in Thorne's quarters, a modest room above the Marshal's office, furnished with little more than a bed, a desk, and a wood-burning stove. He would cook simple meals, beans and bacon, stew, biscuits that were more solid than fluffy, and she would tell him stories of her father, of the ranch, of the life she had lived before everything fell apart. In return, he told her about his years as a lawman, the cases he'd solved, the criminals he'd brought to justice, the times he'd failed, and the lessons those failures had taught him. He spoke of the men he'd killed, his voice flat and matter-of-fact. Not boasting, but not apologizing either. It was simply part of who he was, part of the life he'd chosen to live. "Do you ever regret it?" Mara asked one night, as they sat by the stove watching the flames dance behind the iron grate. "Becoming a marshal, I mean. Taking on other people's problems instead of building a life of your own." Thorne considered the question for a long moment. "Sometimes," he admitted, "late at night when I'm riding through some godforsaken stretch of desert, chasing after some outlaw who probably isn't worth the bullet it'll take to bring him down, I think about what my life might have been if I'd made different choices. A ranch of my own. A wife. Children. Why didn't you?" "Never found the right woman, I suppose. Or maybe I did, and I was too foolish to recognize it at the time." He shrugged, a gesture that managed to convey both acceptance and regret. "The truth is, this work, this mission, it chose me as much as I chose it. After Thomas saved my life, after I decided to stop being part of the problem and start being part of the solution, I couldn't imagine doing anything else. The world is full of people like Barlow and Whitmore, people who prey on the weak, who abuse their power, who think they can do whatever they want because no one will stop them." His jaw tightened. "Someone has to stop them. And if not me, then who?" Mara stared at him, this complicated man who had given up everything he had to save a stranger. "You really believe that, don't you? That one person can make a difference?" "I have to believe it. Otherwise, what's the point?" She didn't have an answer for that. Instead, she reached out and laid her hand on his, feeling the warmth of his skin through her fingers. They sat like that for a long time, neither speaking, watching the fire burn down to embers. On the third night, a stranger rode into Red Bluff. Mara was in her room when she heard the commotion, raised voices in the street below, the clatter of hooves on packed earth, the unmistakable sound of trouble arriving. She went to her window and looked down just in time to see a man in a dusty blue coat dismounting in front of the marshal's office. He was tall and lean, with silver hair that caught the lamplight, and a bearing that spoke of military discipline. His face was lined with age and authority, and when he turned to survey the street, Mara caught a glimpse of something bright on his chest. A badge. But not a local badge. Something bigger, more official. Federal. She dressed quickly and hurried downstairs, arriving in the office just as Thorne was shaking hands with the stranger. "Mara, this is Marshal James Thornton of the United States Marshal's Service." Thorne's voice was carefully neutral, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. "He's an old friend. We served together in Kansas before I came west." "Ma'am." Thornton tipped his hat, his eyes sharp and assessing. "Gage has told me about your situation. I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you." She looked between the two men, trying to read the undercurrents flowing between them. "Why are you here?" Thornton exchanged a glance with Thorne. "I think that's a conversation best had in private." They gathered in Thorne's quarters, the door locked and the curtains drawn. Thornton stood by the window, his back to the room, while Thorne leaned against his desk and Mara sat on the edge of the bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I've been investigating Judge Harold Whitmore for 2 years, Thornton began, his voice low and clipped. "We know he's behind the land-grabbing operation. We know he's got half the territorial government in his pocket. What we don't have is proof. Hard evidence that would stand up in a federal court." "The documents at the ranch," Mara said. "That's why you're here." Thornton turned to face her. "Gage sent word about what you told him. If those papers exist, if they really contain what you say they do, they could be the key to bringing down Whitmore's entire operation. Not just him, but everyone connected to him. Banks, politicians, lawmen." His eyes narrowed. "Sheriff Barlow, Mara felt a surge of fierce satisfaction. Then you'll help us retrieve them. That's the plan. The three of us, moving together. I've got federal authority to operate anywhere in the territory, which means Barlow and his men can't touch us. Not legally, anyway. And illegally? Thornton's smile was cold. That's why we're going armed. They spent the next hour refining the plan, incorporating Thornton's federal resources into the operation. He had contacts in Santa Fe who could confirm when Whitmore's gathering was taking place. He had access to fresh horses and supplies. And perhaps most importantly, he had the authority to arrest anyone who stood in their way. We leave at dawn, Thornton concluded. That gives us plenty of time to reach the ranch before the gathering ends. Once we have the documents, we ride straight for Santa Fe and present them to the territorial governor. Not the local courts? Mara asked. The local courts are compromised. Whitmore's got judges, prosecutors, clerks, all in his pocket. If we go through normal channels, the evidence will disappear before it ever sees a courtroom. Thornton shook his head. No, we go straight to the top. Governor Axtell is an honest man. Once he sees what we've found, he'll have no choice but to act. Mara looked at Thorne. You're sure about this? I trust James with my life, he said simply. And more importantly, I trust him with yours. She held his gaze for a long moment, searching for any hint of doubt or deception. She found none. All right, she said finally. Dawn it is. That night, Mara couldn't sleep. She lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of Red Bluff settling into darkness. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. A woman laughed. A door slammed, and footsteps faded into silence. Tomorrow, she would ride back to the place where her father had died. Tomorrow, she would face the ghosts of her past. Tomorrow, everything would change. The thought should have terrified her, and perhaps, in some deep part of her soul, it did. But the fear was distant now, muffled by layers of determination and resolve. She had made her choice on that mountain overlook. When she told Thorne why she hadn't given up on that auction platform, she would not give up now. She would not give up ever. A soft knock at her door pulled her from her thoughts. She rose, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders, and opened it to find Thorne standing in the hallway. Couldn't sleep either? He asked. She shook her head. Me neither. He hesitated, then, Mind if I come in? She stepped aside to let him pass. He stood in the center of her small room, looking oddly out of place among the feminine furnishings, the lace curtains, the flowered bedspread, the porcelain wash basin on the dresser. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Thorne said, I've been thinking about what happens after. After what? After we get the documents. After Whitmore and Barlow are arrested. After all of this is over. He met her eyes, and there was something vulnerable in his expression, something she had never seen before. Where will you go? Mara hadn't thought about it. Not really. Her entire focus had been on revenge, on justice, on making the men who had destroyed her life pay for what they'd done. She hadn't considered what would come after, what kind of future might be waiting for her on the other side of this crusade. I don't know, she admitted. The ranch is gone, legally anyway. Even if we bring down the consortium, even if my father's name is cleared, the Double Star isn't mine anymore. The bank foreclosed. The cattle are scattered across Mexico. There's nothing left to go back to. Then build something new. She looked at him sharply. What do you mean? I mean, he took a step closer to her, his voice dropping to barely more than a whisper. I mean, you don't have to do this alone. Whatever comes next, wherever you decide to go, you don't have to face it by yourself. Mara's heart was pounding. Are you saying what I think you're saying? I'm saying that I've spent 15 years keeping people at arm's length, telling myself I didn't need anyone, that I was better off alone, that relationships were a weakness I couldn't afford. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers curling around hers with surprising tenderness. And then I saw you on that platform, and something changed, something I can't explain and can't ignore. Gage, I'm not asking for anything, he said quickly. I know you've been through hell. I know you need time to heal. I'm not trying to rush you into something you're not ready for. He drew a shaky breath. But I want you to know that when this is over, when you're free to choose your own path, I'd like to walk that path with you. If you'll have me. Mara stared at him. at this man who had given up everything to save her, who had treated her with nothing but kindness and respect, who had seen her at her lowest and never once looked away. And she felt something crack open inside her chest. Not breaking, healing. "I don't know what the future holds," she said slowly. "I don't know who I'm going to be when all of this is over, but I know one thing." She stepped closer, close enough to feel the warmth of his body through her thin nightgown. "I know that I wouldn't be here without you, and I know that whatever happens next, I want you to be part of it." Thorn's breath caught. "Mara." She rose on her toes and kissed him. It was a gentle kiss, tentative and exploratory, two wounded souls reaching out to each other across the darkness. His lips were warm against hers, his stubble rough against her skin, and when his arms came up to wrap around her, she felt herself melting into him like snow in spring sunshine. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing hard. "We should get some sleep," Thorn said, his voice rough. "Big day tomorrow." "Stay." The word was out before she could stop it. "Just stay. I don't want to be alone tonight." He hesitated for only a moment, then he nodded. They lay down together on her narrow bed, fully clothed, his arm around her waist, and her head resting on his chest. She could hear his heartbeat, strong and steady, and she found herself matching her breathing to its rhythm. For the first time since her father's death, she didn't feel afraid of the darkness. For the first time in weeks, she slept without nightmares. Dawn came too quickly. They rose in the gray half-light, moving quietly through their preparations. Thorn returned to his quarters to gather his weapons, while Mara dressed in practical riding clothes, trousers she had borrowed from Billy, a loose shirt, sturdy boots that had seen better days. By the time the sun cleared the eastern mountains, they were assembled in front of the Marshal's office. Thorn on his black gelding, Mara on her bay mare, Thornton on a steel-gray stallion that looked like it could run forever. The pack mule was loaded with supplies, its ears flicking nervously in the early morning chill. "Everyone ready?" Thornton asked. Thorn looked at Mara. She met his gaze and nodded. "Ready." They rode out of Red Bluff as the town was beginning to stir, following the road south until it disappeared into the desert. Then they turned east toward the mountains, toward the canyons, toward the ranch where Mara's father had lived and died. The first day passed without incident. They traveled in silence for the most part, conserving their energy for the journey ahead. The terrain grew rougher as they climbed into the foothills, the trail narrowing to little more than a goat path that wound between towering rock formations. Thornton rode in front, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. Thorn brought up the rear, his rifle across his saddle, his posture alert and ready. And Mara rode between them, her mind churning with memories she had tried so hard to forget. That boulder there. She had climbed it with her father when she was 8, laughing as he pretended to be unable to keep up. That twisted pine tree, she had carved her initials into its bark one summer afternoon, marking her territory like a queen claiming her kingdom. That dry creek bed. She had followed it all the way to its source once, discovering a hidden spring where deer came to drink at dawn. Every landmark was a ghost, a reminder of a life that had been stolen from her. But she didn't cry. She had done her crying. Now was the time for action. They made camp that night in a shallow cave, hidden from view by a curtain of juniper branches. Thornton took the first watch while Thorn and Mara ate a cold meal of hardtack and dried beef. "How much farther?" Thornton asked when they had finished. "Another day and a half," Mara replied. "We'll reach the canyon entrance by tomorrow evening if we keep this pace." "And the ranch itself?" "A few hours beyond that. We should arrive well after midnight, late enough that anyone on watch will be tired, but early enough that we'll have time to search before dawn." Thornton nodded, apparently satisfied. "Try to get some sleep. I'll wake you in 4 hours." But Mara couldn't sleep. She lay beside Thorn, listening to his steady breathing, watching the stars wheel slowly overhead through a gap in the branches. Tomorrow night, she would walk through the door of the house where she had grown up. She would stand in the rooms where her father had laughed and cried and lived and died. She would descend into the hidden chamber beneath the barn and retrieve the documents that would bring his killers to justice. And then, she didn't know what came next. But for the first time, that uncertainty didn't feel like terror. It felt like possibility. The second day brought trouble. They had just entered the canyon system, a maze of narrow passages and sheer cliffs that Mara knew as well as her own face, when Thornton held up his hand, signaling a halt. "Riders," he said quietly. 2 miles back. Moving fast. Thorn pulled his rifle from its scabbard. "How many?" "Hard to say. At least 4, maybe more." "Barlow's men?" "Could be, or just travelers passing through." Thornton's expression was grim. "Either way, we can't take any chances. Is there another route?" Mara thought quickly, running through the mental map of the canyon she had built over years of exploration. "There's a side passage about half a mile ahead. It's narrow, barely wide enough for one horse, but it comes out near the eastern ridge. We can circle around and approach the ranch from the back." "Will it cost us time?" "A few hours, maybe more." Thornton exchanged a glance with Thorn. "Better late than dead." They pushed on, moving as quickly as the treacherous terrain would allow. The side passage was exactly where Mara remembered, a crack in the canyon wall that looked like nothing more than a shadow until you were standing directly in front of it. They had to dismount and lead their horses through single file, the rock walls pressing close enough to scrape against their shoulders. Mara went first, picking her way over loose stones and ducking under low-hanging outcroppings. Behind her, she could hear Thorn murmuring reassurances to his gelding, which was snorting nervously at the confined space. It took nearly an hour to reach the other side, and when they finally emerged onto the eastern ridge, the sun was already sinking toward the horizon. "We'll have to push through the night," Thornton said, checking his pocket watch. "Can't afford to lose any more time." Mara nodded, though exhaustion was beginning to pull at her limbs. "I know the way. I can lead us even in the dark." True to her word, she guided them through the moonless night, relying on memory and instinct to navigate the treacherous terrain. By the time the first hint of false dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, they were within sight of the Double Star Ranch. It looked different in the darkness, smaller somehow, and sadder. The main house was dark, no light showing in any of the windows. The barn loomed to the left like a hunched giant. Beyond them both, the empty corrals and overgrown pastures spoke of a ranch that had been abandoned, forgotten, left to decay. "2 guards," Thornton reported, his voice barely above a whisper. "One at the front door, one walking the perimeter." "Only 2, oi?" Mara asked. "I told you, skeleton crew. Most of Barlow's men will be at Whitmore's gathering. Then we wait until they change shifts. The relief will be tired, less alert." She pointed towards a cluster of rocks overlooking the property. "We can watch from there." They settled in to wait, the cold of the pre-dawn hours seeping into their bones. Mara watched her childhood home through narrowed eyes, cataloging every change, every sign of the men who had invaded it. New curtains in the front windows, cheap, gaudy things that would have made her father scowl. A pile of empty bottles beside the porch, evidence of nights spent drinking instead of working. A broken fence rail that no one had bothered to repair. These men didn't care about the ranch. They didn't care about the land or the animals or the legacy that Thomas Ellington had spent his life building. They were parasites, nothing more. Feeding on what others had created, destroying what they couldn't consume. And tonight, Mara would take back what they had stolen. The guard change came just as the eastern sky began to pink with the approaching sunrise. Mara watched as a sleepy-looking man stumbled out of the bunkhouse to relieve the perimeter guard, scratching himself and yawning. "Now," she whispered. They moved like shadows, 3 shapes flowing through the darkness toward the barn. Thorn led the way, his footsteps utterly silent on the packed earth. Thornton brought up the rear, his pistol drawn and ready. Mara's heart was pounding so loudly she was sure the guards would hear it, but they made it to the barn without incident, slipping through the side door and into the musty darkness within. The smell hit her first, hay and leather and horse sweat, so achingly familiar that it brought tears to her eyes. This was where her father had taught her to ride, where they had nursed sick calves back to health, where she had hidden from thunderstorms, burying her face in a horse's mane while the sky raged outside. "Mara." Thorn's voice was gentle. "The documents." She nodded, pushing the memories aside. Later. There would be time for grief later. She led them to the back of the barn, to a stall that had always been kept empty. The floor was covered with old straw, apparently undisturbed, But Mara knew better. She knelt and brushed the straw aside, revealing a wooden trapdoor set into the earth. "Help me with this." Thorn crouched beside her, and together they lifted the heavy door. A ladder descended into darkness below. "I'll go first," Mara whispered. "There may be traps." She climbed down carefully, testing each rung before putting her weight on it. The hidden room was exactly as she remembered, small and musty, lined with shelves that held her father's most precious possessions. His wedding ring, which he had removed after her mother's death and never worn again. A lock of hair from Mara's first haircut. A faded daguerreotype of a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. And in the corner, a locked strongbox. Mara's hands trembled as she lifted it from its shelf. She knew the combination by heart, her mother's birthday, and the lock clicked open with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the stillness. Inside was everything they needed. Letters from Judge Whitmore to Sheriff Barlow, detailing payments for services rendered. Forged debt documents, complete with the seal of a bank that had never actually issued them. A ledger of cattle sales, showing exactly where the stolen herds had gone and who had profited from them. And most damning of all, a sworn statement from the fake doctor admitting that Thomas Ellington's death certificate had been falsified. Mara clutched the documents to her chest, tears streaming down her face. "Got it," she called up. "I've got everything." She climbed back up the ladder, Thorn's hands reaching down to help her. They were so close now, so close to justice, to revenge, to finally making things right. That was when the barn door slammed open. "Well, well," said a voice Mara would never forget. "Look what the cat dragged in." Sheriff Vernon Barlow stepped into the light, flanked by half a dozen armed men, and he was smiling. The barn seemed to shrink around them as Barlow's men fanned out, their rifles trained on the three figures standing in the shadows. Mara felt Thorn's hand close around her arm, pulling her behind him even as he raised his own weapon. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Marshal." Barlow's voice was thick with satisfaction. "You're outnumbered and outgunned, and my boys here have been drinking all night. Their aim might be a little shaky. Wouldn't want any accidents." Thorn didn't lower his rifle. "How did you know we were coming?" "You think I survived this long by being stupid?" Barlow stepped forward, his boots crunching on the straw-covered floor. "I've got eyes everywhere, Thorn. Every town, every trail, every canyon in this territory. The moment you rode out of Red Bluff, I knew about it." "The gathering in Santa Fe," Thornton said, his voice flat. "It was a trap." "Now you're catching on." Barlow grinned, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. "There never was a gathering. Just a story we spread around, knowing that sooner or later it would reach the right ears." His gaze shifted to Mara, and his smile turned cruel. "Hello again, sweetheart. Miss me?" Mara's grip tightened on the strongbox. She could feel the documents inside, the weight of all that evidence pressing against her chest. They had come so close, so impossibly close. "You killed my father," she said, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. "Your father killed himself when he refused to sell his land." Barlow shrugged, as if discussing the weather. "We gave him every chance, made him generous offers. But he was stubborn, just like you." He took another step forward, close enough now that Mara could smell the whiskey on his breath. "Should have known his daughter would be trouble too. That's why I'm not making the same mistake twice." "What's that supposed to mean?" Thorn demanded. Barlow's eyes never left Mara's face. "It means I'm done playing games." The auction was a nice touch. "Got to admit, I enjoyed watching you squirm up there on that platform, but it attracted too much attention. Marshals poking around, asking questions, stirring up trouble." He shook his head slowly. "No, this time we're going to do things the simple way. 3 bodies in a shallow grave. No witnesses, no evidence, no complications." "You can't just murder a federal marshal and expect to get away with it," Thornton said. "Can I?" Barlow laughed. "Marshal Thornton, I've been getting away with things for 20 years. Killed more men than I can count, stolen more cattle than I can remember, put more landowners in the ground than—" He stopped, his eyes narrowing. "But you know what? I'm tired of talking. Boys, take their weapons." The men moved forward, and for one terrible moment, Mara thought it was over. She thought about all the things she would never do, the revenge she would never have, the future she would never see, the life with Thorn that had been snatched away before it could even begin. Then Thornton moved. It happened so fast that Mara barely saw it. One moment the federal marshal was standing with his hands raised. The next, he was diving to the side, his pistol spitting fire as he rolled behind a hay bale. One of Barlow's men went down with a scream, clutching his leg. Another spun away, blood spraying from his shoulder. "Go!" Thornton shouted. "I'll hold them off." Thorne didn't hesitate. He grabbed Mara's arm and pulled her toward the back of the barn, toward the door that led to the rear pastures. Bullets whined through the air around them, punching holes in the wooden walls, sending splinters flying. They burst through the door into the cold night air. The moon had risen while they were inside, casting the landscape in shades of silver and shadow. Mara could see the horses, their horses, tied to a fence post 50 yards away. "Run!" Thorne pushed her forward, turning to fire back through the open doorway. "Get to the horses! Don't stop for anything!" She ran. Her boots pounded against the hard-packed earth, her lungs burning with each ragged breath. Behind her, she could hear the crack of gunfire, the shouts of men, the chaos of a battle she couldn't see. The strongbox was clutched to her chest like a lifeline, its contents bouncing against her ribs with each desperate stride. The horses were spooked by the noise, dancing and pulling at their reins. Mara fumbled with the knots, her fingers clumsy with fear. "Come on! Come on!" The rope came free just as Thorne reached her side. "Mount up!" He was already swinging onto his gelding, reaching down to help her onto the bay mare. "Thornton's buying us time, but it won't last. We need to—" A gunshot cracked through the night, and Thorne jerked. Mara watched in horror as he slumped forward in the saddle, his hand going to his side. Blood, black in the moonlight, seeped between his fingers. "Gage!" "I'm fine." His voice was tight with pain. "Just a graze. Keep riding." But she could see the truth in his face, could see the way his jaw clenched against the agony. It wasn't a graze. It was bad. Maybe worse than bad. They rode anyway. The horses' hooves thundered across the empty pastures, heading for the eastern canyons. Mara could hear pursuit behind them. Horses, shouts, the occasional crack of a distant rifle. But she didn't look back. Looking back wouldn't help. Looking back would only slow them down. The canyon entrance loomed ahead, a dark gash in the moonlit cliffs. Mara guided her mare toward it without thinking, her body moving on instinct while her mind struggled to process what was happening. Thorne was hurt. Thornton was still at the ranch, fighting alone against impossible odds. And Barlow's men were gaining on them, their horses fresh and their riders motivated by greed and bloodlust. They weren't going to make it. The thought crystallized in her mind with terrible clarity. They weren't going to outrun their pursuers. They weren't going to reach Red Bluff. They weren't going to deliver the documents to the governor. All of it, the weeks of planning, the hope of justice, the promise of a future, was going to end here, in this God-forsaken canyon, with bullets in their backs and their bodies left for the coyotes. No. The word came out of her mouth before she knew she was speaking. No. She had not survived the auction to die like this. She had not found Thorne, had not discovered love in the ashes of her grief, had not come this far just to fail. "Mara," Thorne's voice was weak, his words slurring. "There's a place up ahead, narrow passage, can hold them off." She saw what he meant, a gap in the canyon wall, barely wide enough for a single horse. The perfect choke point, the perfect place to make a stand. "Can you shoot?" she asked. "I can. Still pull a trigger." That would have to be enough. They dismounted at the entrance to the narrow passage, Thorne leaning heavily against his horse as Mara helped him to the ground. His shirt was soaked with blood now, the wound worse than he had admitted. But his eyes were still clear, and when she pressed his rifle into his hands, his grip was steady. "Get behind me," he said. "When they come through—" "No!" Mara drew her own pistol, one of Thorne's spares, pressed into her hands during their flight from the barn. "We fight together, side by side." "Mara, you don't—" "I know how to shoot." Her voice was fierce. "My father taught me, said a woman in this territory needed to know how to defend herself." She met his eyes, willing him to understand. "I'm not hiding anymore, Gage. I'm done being a victim." For a moment, something softened in his pain-ravaged face. Then he nodded. "Together," he agreed. They waited. The sounds of pursuit grew louder, horses' hooves, men's voices, the jingle of metal. Mara counted the seconds, her finger resting lightly on the trigger of her pistol. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Her hands were steady. The first rider appeared at the canyon entrance, silhouetted against the moonlit sky. Thorn fired. The man toppled from his horse with a cry, hitting the ground hard enough to raise a cloud of dust. Before he could move, before he could even reach for his fallen weapon, Mara squeezed her trigger and sent a bullet into his chest. Two more riders came through, and they dropped them both. Thorn's rifle speaking once, twice, each shot precise despite his injury. The bodies piled up at the canyon entrance, creating a barrier that forced the remaining pursuers to dismount. "There's too many," Thorn gasped, reloading with hands that trembled. "I count at least 4 more, maybe 5. Mara's pistol was empty. She fumbled for more bullets, her fingers slick with sweat. Where were they? Where? A figure burst through the gap to her left, moving faster than she would have thought possible. She saw the glint of moonlight on a knife blade, saw the snarl on the man's face as he lunged for her throat. And then the man's head snapped back, a dark hole appearing in his forehead, and he collapsed at her feet. "Miss me?" Mara spun around. Marshal James Thornton was climbing through a crack in the canyon wall, his clothes torn and his face bloody, but his eyes very much alive. He was limping badly, and one arm hung limp at his side, but he was carrying a smoking pistol in his good hand and wearing a grin that seemed entirely inappropriate for the circumstances. "Thornton!" Thorn's voice cracked with relief. You thought wrong." The federal marshal slid into cover beside them, wincing as his injured leg gave way. "Took a bullet in the arm and played dead. They bought it long enough for me to slip out the back." He glanced at the bodies piled at the canyon entrance. "I see you two have been busy." "There's more coming," Mara said. "Then we'd better even the odds." Thornton reached into his coat and pulled out a stick of dynamite. Where he had gotten it, Mara couldn't imagine. "Cover your ears." He lit the fuse and hurled it toward the canyon entrance. The explosion was deafening. The ground shook beneath their feet, and a wall of rock and dust came crashing down, sealing the narrow passage with tons of debris. When the dust settled, silence fell over the canyon. No more gunshots, no more shouting, just the soft moan of the wind and the distant cry of a nightbird. "That'll hold them for a while," Thornton said, satisfaction in his voice. "But not forever. We need to keep moving." Mara looked at Thorn. He was pale, far too pale, and his breathing had become shallow and labored. The blood stain on his shirt had spread, reaching now almost to his belt. "He needs a doctor," she said. "There's a logging camp about 10 miles from here," Thornton replied. "Friends of mine. They'll have medical supplies, horses, men who can help us." He looked at Thorn, his expression grim. "Can you make it?" Thorn's jaw tightened. "I'll make it." They helped him onto his horse, Mara climbing up behind him to keep him steady in the saddle. Thornton took the lead, guiding them through the darkness by instinct and starlight. The ride was agony. Every step the horse took sent a fresh wave of pain through Thorn's body. Mara could feel him trembling against her, could feel the heat of fever already beginning to build in his skin. She held on to him as tightly as she could, whispering words of encouragement that she wasn't sure he could hear. "Stay with me, Gage. Stay with me. We're almost there." The miles stretched out like years. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to the struggle playing out beneath them. Mara's arms ached from holding Thorn upright, and her eyes burned with tears she refused to let fall. She thought about the first time she had seen him, that tall stranger in the saloon doorway, offering $1,000 for her freedom. She thought about the ride through the desert, the conversations by firelight, the moment on the mountain when she had finally let herself cry. She thought about the kiss they had shared, the promise they had made, the future they had dared to imagine. "Don't you dare die on me," she whispered into his ear. "Don't you dare leave me alone. Not after everything we've been through, not when we're so close." Thorn's hand found hers in the darkness. His grip was weak, but it was there. "Not going anywhere," he managed. "Told you. I'd see this through." "Then keep your damn promise." The faintest hint of a smile crossed his bloodless lips. "Yes, ma'am." Dawn was breaking when they finally reached the logging camp. It was a rough collection of buildings clustered at the base of a forested mountain, bunkhouses, a mess hall, a sawmill that sat silent and still in the early morning light, Men were already emerging from their quarters, drawn by the sound of approaching hooves. Thornton! A big man with a red beard came running toward them, his face creased with concern. What the hell happened to you? Long story, McCready. Right now I need your doctor and your hospitality. Thornton slid from his horse, barely keeping his feet. And I need men, good men, men willing to fight. McCready's eyes swept over their battered group. The injured marshal, the wounded lawman, the woman with blood on her hands and fire in her eyes. You've got them, he said simply. They carried Thorne into the bunkhouse and laid him on a cot, while McCready's doctor, a grizzled old man with steady hands and a no-nonsense manner, went to work on his wound. Mara watched from his doorway, her heart in her throat, as the doctor cut away Thorne's blood-soaked shirt and began to probe the injury. Bullet's still in there, the doctor announced. Lodged against a rib. I can get it out, but it's going to hurt like hell. Do it, Thorne said through gritted teeth. Mara moved to his side and took his hand. I'm here. His eyes found hers, and despite the pain, despite the blood loss, despite everything, he managed a ghost of a smile. I know. The next hour was the longest of Mara's life. She held Thorne's hand while the doctor worked, feeling every flinch, every gasp, every moment of agony that rippled through his body. She talked to him about anything, everything, whatever came to mind, trying to keep his attention focused on her voice instead of the metal instruments probing his flesh. She told him about her mother, about the songs she used to sing at bedtime. She told him about the first horse she ever owned, a spotted pony named Patches, who had thrown her more times than she could count. She told him about the time she got lost in the canyons as a child and spent the night curled up in a cave, terrified but determined not to cry. And through it all, Thorne held onto her hand like a drowning man holds onto a rope, his grip tightening every time the pain became too much but never letting go. Finally, the doctor held up a misshapen piece of lead, bloody and glinting in the lamplight. Got it, he said. Now I just need to clean and stitch. He'll live, assuming infection doesn't set in. Mara's legs gave way. She sank onto the edge of the cot, all the strength draining out of her body in a rush of relief so intense it left her dizzy. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you. The doctor grunted. Don't thank me yet. He's not out of the woods, but he's strong. I can see that. And he's got something worth fighting for. His eyes flickered to Mara's face, then back to his work. That makes a difference. While Thorne rested and the doctor finished his work, Thornton gathered the men of the logging camp in the mess hall. Mara stood beside him, the strongbox still clutched in her arms, as he laid out the situation in blunt, unvarnished terms. Judge Harold Whitmore runs a criminal empire that stretches across this entire territory, he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. He's responsible for the deaths of at least a dozen landowners, the theft of thousands of head of cattle, and the corruption of officials at every level of government. His right-hand man, Sheriff Vernon Barlow, is a murderer who sells women like livestock and buries anyone who stands in his way. A murmur ran through the assembled men. They were a rough lot, lumberjacks and sawyers, teamsters and cooks, but they had honest faces, and their eyes were hard with the look of men who knew injustice when they heard about it. Why should we get involved? One man called out. This ain't our fight. Because if men like Whitmore and Barlow can do what they've done and get away with it, no one in this territory is safe. Thornton's voice rose with passion. Today it's ranchers. Tomorrow it could be logging camps, your land, your families, your lives. He slammed his fist on the table. We stand together now, or we fall separately later. There is no middle ground. Silence fell over the mess hall. Mara could feel the weight of decision pressing down on the room, could see the men exchanging glances, measuring the risks against the rewards. Then McCready stood up. I've known James Thornton for 15 years, the big man said, his voice rumbling like distant thunder. He's never asked me for anything he wasn't willing to give himself. If he says these men are a threat to all of us, I believe him. He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of each man in turn. I'm in. Who's with me? One by one, hands went up. Within an hour, they had assembled a force of 20 men, loggers with axes and rifles, teamsters with shotguns and courage, ordinary workers transformed into soldiers by the simple power of a righteous cause. Mara watched them prepare, a strange mixture of hope and dread churning in her stomach. This was really happening. After all the running, all the hiding, all the desperate hours of planning and praying, they were finally going to fight back. But Barlow would be coming. The dynamite had bought them time, but not safety. He would dig through the rubble, find a way around, track them to the logging camp, and bring the full weight of his hired guns down on their heads. The question was, would they be ready? The answer came 3 days later. Thorne was on his feet by then, pale and weak, but moving under his own power. The doctor had done good work, and whatever iron ran in the Marshal's veins seemed to be proof against infection. He spent his waking hours helping to fortify the camp, directing the placement of barricades and the positioning of riflemen with the tactical mind of a man who had fought in a dozen frontier skirmishes. Mara stayed close to him, partly to help, and partly because she couldn't bear to let him out of her sight. Every time he winced at a sudden movement, every time his hand went unconsciously to his bandaged side, her heart clenched with a fear she couldn't name. "You should be resting," she told him on the second night, as they stood together on the camp's perimeter, watching the forest for signs of movement. "I'll rest when this is over." "You'll rest when you collapse from exhaustion, more like." A smile flickered across his weathered face. "You're starting to sound like my mother. Someone has to look after you, since you clearly won't do it yourself." He turned to look at her, his pale eyes soft in the moonlight. "Someone already does." She felt heat rise in her cheeks, grateful for the darkness that hid her blush. "Gage, I've been thinking," he said, his voice dropping to barely more than a whisper, "about what happens after, about what I said in Red Bluff." He paused, struggling with words that didn't come easily to a man like him. "I meant every word, but I need you to know, whatever you decide, whatever path you choose, I'll support you, even if that path doesn't include me." Mara's breath caught. "Why would you think—" "Because you've been through hell. Because you deserve the chance to build your own life, on your own terms, without some broken-down lawman trailing after you like a lost dog." His jaw tightened. "I don't want you to feel obligated. To me or to anyone. You're free now, Mara. That's what matters." For a long moment she couldn't speak. The weight of his words pressed down on her, forcing her to confront feelings she had been too busy, too scared, too overwhelmed to examine. Did she love him? She thought she might. The way her heart raced when he was near, the way her chest ached when he was hurt, the way she couldn't imagine a future that didn't have him in it, all of it pointed to an answer she wasn't quite ready to admit. But he was right about one thing. She had been through hell, and she was still climbing out of it, still finding her footing on the other side. She didn't know who she would be when the smoke cleared and the dead were buried. She didn't know what she would want, what she would need, what would make her whole again. All she knew was that right now, in this moment, she wanted him beside her. "I'm not choosing out of obligation," she said finally. "I'm choosing because you're the first person in my life who saw me, really saw me, and didn't look away." She reached out and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "Whatever comes next, I want to face it with you. Not because I owe you, because I want to." Thorne's grip tightened on her hand. For a moment, he didn't speak. Then he raised her fingers to his lips and kissed them, a gesture so tender it made her eyes burn with tears she refused to shed. "Then together it is," he said. The attack came at dawn on the third day. Mara was asleep in one of the bunkhouses when the first shots rang out, snapping her awake with the brutal efficiency of a bucket of ice water. She grabbed her pistol and ran outside to find chaos erupting around her. Barlow's men were coming from 3 directions. Dozens of them, more than she had expected, pouring out of the forest like a dark tide. Gunfire crackled through the cold morning air, and men on both sides fell screaming to the ground. "The barricade!" Thornton's voice cut through the confusion. "Hold the barricade!" Mara raced toward the north side of the camp, where a makeshift wall of logs and barrels had been erected across the main approach. Thorne was already there, rifle in hand, directing fire at the advancing enemy. She dropped into position beside him, her pistol raised, and began to shoot. The battle was unlike anything she had ever experienced. In the stories her father had told, gunfights were quick and decisive. A moment of tension, a flash of violence, and then it was over. The reality was far messier. It was smoke and noise and confusion, bodies falling and men screaming, the copper stink of blood mixing with the acrid bite of gunpowder. Mara fired until her pistol was empty, reloaded with trembling fingers, fired again. She didn't think about the men she was shooting at, didn't let herself wonder about their families, their lives, the choices that had led them to this moment. There was only the gun in her hand and the targets in front of her and the desperate primal need to survive. "They're pulling back," someone shouted. It was true. The first wave of attackers was retreating, leaving behind a scattered carpet of bodies. But even as Mara felt a surge of hope, she heard Thornton curse under his breath. That wasn't a real assault. That was a test, feeling out our defenses. "How many more do you think there are?" Thorne asked. Hard to say. But if Barlow's smart, and he is, he's got reinforcements coming. This was just the opening move. They had less than an hour to regroup before the second attack came. This time, Barlow led it himself. Mara saw him through a gap in the barricade, that barrel-chested figure with the cruel smile and the badge that had once represented law and order. He was shouting orders to his men, directing them with the cold efficiency of a general commanding his troops. "Focus fire on the north wall. Davidson, take your men around the flank. I want that camp in ashes by noon." The fighting was fiercer this time. Barlow's men pushed harder, and the defenders pushed back, and the air filled with the thunder of guns and the screams of the wounded. Mara emptied her pistol twice, 3 times, her arm aching from the recoil. Beside her, Thorne was a machine, firing, reloading, firing again, with the calm precision of a man who had done this 100 times before. But she could see the strain on his face, the way his bandaged wound was seeping fresh blood through his shirt. "You're bleeding!" she shouted over the noise. "Noticed." He didn't stop firing. "Worry about it later." The battle raged for what felt like hours. Men fell on both sides, some dead, some wounded, some simply too exhausted to continue. The barricades began to splinter under the assault, gaps appearing in the defensive line. And then, just when it seemed like Barlow's forces would overwhelm them, Mara heard something that changed everything. Hoofbeats. Dozens of them. Coming from the west. She turned, her heart in her throat, expecting to see more of Barlow's reinforcements arriving to finish them off. Instead, she saw a column of riders cresting the hill, men in blue uniforms, with rifles gleaming in the morning sun, and a flag she recognized streaming above them. The United States Army. "Cavalry!" McCready's voice boomed across the camp. "It's the goddamn cavalry!" The effect on Barlow's men was immediate and devastating. They broke and ran, scattering into the forest like leaves before a storm. Some threw down their weapons. Others tried to fight and were cut down by the arriving soldiers. Within minutes, the battle was over. Mara stood amid the chaos, her pistol hanging limp at her side, watching as soldiers surrounded the camp and began to secure the area. She felt numb, disconnected from her body, floating somewhere above the carnage and the smoke. A hand touched her shoulder. She turned to find Thorne standing behind her, his face gray with pain but his eyes bright with something that might have been wonder. "We won," he said. "We won," she repeated, the words feeling strange and unreal on her tongue. And then, without warning, she was crying, great heaving sobs that shook her entire body. All the fear, all the tension, all the trauma of the past weeks came pouring out of her in a flood that she couldn't control and didn't try to. Thorne pulled her into his arms, holding her close while she wept, murmuring words she couldn't hear but understood anyway. They had won. But it wasn't over yet. The cavalry had been dispatched from Fort Harrison, 50 miles to the north, after receiving word from one of Thornton's contacts in Santa Fe. They had ridden through the night to reach the logging camp, arriving just in time to turn the tide of battle. Their commander, a stern-faced major named Hadley, listened to Thornton's report with growing fury on his face. When the federal marshal finished, Hadley turned to look at the documents Mara had retrieved from her father's ranch. "This is damning evidence," he said, flipping through the pages. Judge Whitmore, Sheriff Barlow, half the territorial government, all of them implicated in murder and fraud. "Can you arrest them?" Mara asked. "I can do better than that." Hadley's jaw set with determination. "I can escort you to Santa Fe personally, along with 50 armed soldiers. Let's see Whitmore try to make these documents disappear when he's got cavalry rifles pointed at his head. But there was one piece of unfinished business. "Where's Barlow?" Thorne asked, looking around at the captured and the dead. Silence. A cold feeling settled in Mara's stomach. She scanned the faces of the prisoners, searching for that barrel-chested figure, that cruel smile, that badge. He wasn't there. "He escaped during the battle," one of the soldiers reported. "Rode off with a handful of men before we could cut off the retreat." Thornton cursed under his breath. "He'll head for Santo Vega, try to gather more men, maybe flee across the border." "Then we go after him," Mara said. Everyone turned to look at her. "He killed my father. He sold me like livestock. He hunted us across the territory and tried to murder us in that canyon." Her voice was low, but it carried the force of a hammer striking an anvil. "I am not going to Santa Fe to testify against corrupt officials while the man who destroyed my life rides free." "Mara," Thorne began. "I'm not asking for permission." She met his eyes, her own blazing with a fury that had been building for weeks. "I'm going, with or without you." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Thorne sighed, a sound of resignation, of acceptance, of something that might have been pride. "Well," he said, "I guess we're going after Barlow." They rode out within the hour. Mara, Thorne, Thornton, and a dozen of Macready's men who had volunteered for the mission. Major Hadley protested, insisting that they should leave Barlow to the army, but Mara's determination was immovable. "He's mine," she said. "After everything he's done, he's mine." The trail to Santo Vega wound through canyons and across dry riverbeds, past abandoned homesteads, and through ghost towns that had been swallowed by the desert. They rode hard, pushing their horses to the limit, driven by the knowledge that every hour they delayed gave Barlow more time to prepare. Mara rode at the front of the column, her eyes fixed on the horizon, her mind churning with plans for what would happen when they arrived. She knew, with a certainty that surprised her, that this would end in blood. Barlow would not surrender. He would not go quietly to a federal prison. He would fight to the last breath, and so would she. But the closer they got to Santo Vega, the more a different kind of certainty began to take hold. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It wasn't just about making Barlow pay for what he'd done. It was about something bigger, something that had been building inside her since the moment Thorne had cut her ropes on that auction platform. It was about justice, real justice, not the kind that could be bought or sold, not the kind that depended on who had the most money or the most guns, the kind that came from standing up to evil, even when you were afraid, the kind that came from refusing to let the powerful crush the weak beneath their boots. Her father had believed in that kind of justice. He had died for it. And now, as she rode toward the final confrontation with his killer, Mara realized that she was finally ready to fight for it too. They reached Santo Vega as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of blood and fire. The town looked different than she remembered, smaller somehow, and dirtier. The same buildings lined the same dusty streets, but they seemed to have shrunk in the weeks since she'd last seen them. The Silver Spur Saloon, where she had been sold like cattle, sat squat and ugly at the center of town, its windows dark and its doors closed. "Looks quiet," Thornton observed. "Too quiet," Thorne agreed. His hand rested on the butt of his pistol, his eyes scanning the empty streets. "Barlow knows we're coming. He's had time to prepare." They dismounted at the edge of town, tying their horses to a hitching post near the livery stable. Mara checked her weapons, pistol loaded, rifle slung across her back, knife tucked into her boot. Her hands were steady, her heart was calm. "I'll take the front," Thorne said. "Thornton, you circle around back with half the men. The rest of you spread out and cover the streets. If anyone tries to run—" "Wait!" Mara held up her hand. "I'm going in first." "The hell you are." "He won't shoot me on sight." She met Thorne's eyes, willing him to understand. "He wants me, Gage. He's wanted me since the moment I escaped that auction block. If I walk in there alone, he'll be too busy gloating to notice you moving into position. That's suicide. It's strategy." She stepped closer to him, lowering her voice so only he could hear. "I know what I'm doing. I know the risks, but this ends tonight, one way or another, and I need to be the one to end it." Thorne stared at her for a long moment, his jaw tight with frustration and fear. She could see the battle playing out behind his eyes, the Marshal who wanted to protect her warring with the man who understood her need to face this herself. Finally, he exhaled heavily. 5 minutes. I give you 5 minutes to get him talking, then I'm coming in, no matter what. That's all I need. She kissed him, quick and fierce, a promise and a goodbye rolled into one, and then she turned and walked toward the Silver Spur Saloon. The doors creaked as she pushed them open. The interior was dark, lit only by a handful of lanterns that cast dancing shadows across the walls. Tables and chairs had been overturned, and the mirror behind the bar was cracked, as if someone had thrown a bottle at it in a fit of rage. And there, sitting at a table near the back of the room, was Sheriff Vernon Barlow. He looked terrible. His clothes were torn and blood-stained, his face covered in cuts and bruises. The arrogance she remembered had been replaced by something desperate, something cornered and dangerous. But when he saw her walk through the door, that cruel smile slowly spread across his lips. "Well, well," he said, "look who finally came home." Mara stepped deeper into the saloon, her boots making soft sounds on the sawdust-covered floor. The smell of the place was exactly as she remembered, whiskey and tobacco smoke and something darker underneath, something that spoke of violence and desperation and deals made in shadows. Barlow didn't move from his chair. He sat with his back to the wall, a half-empty bottle on the table in front of him and a pistol resting near his right hand. His eyes tracked her across the room with the lazy confidence of a predator watching wounded prey. "Close the door behind you," he said. "We've got some catching up to do." Mara didn't close the door. She stopped about 20 feet from his table, close enough to see the sweat glistening on his brow, but far enough that she could react if he went for his gun. "You look tired, Sheriff," she said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "Running for your life must be exhausting." Barlow's smile flickered. "Running? Sweetheart, I'm not running. I'm regrouping." He gestured at the empty saloon around them. "You think this is the end? You think killing a few of my boys and bringing in some cavalry changes anything? I've got friends everywhere. Judges, politicians, businessmen. One telegram and I'll have an army at my back." "Your friends are abandoning you as we speak." Mara took another step forward. "The documents we recovered from my father's ranch, they're already on their way to Santa Fe. Judge Whitmore's name is all over them. So is yours." Something shifted in Barlow's eyes, a flicker of uncertainty, quickly masked. "Those papers won't hold up in court. My lawyers—" "Your lawyers work for Whitmore, and Whitmore is finished." She allowed herself a small, cold smile. "By tomorrow morning, federal marshals will be kicking down his door. Everyone connected to your little operation, the bankers, the officials, the hired guns, they'll all be scrambling to save themselves. And you know what happens to men like you when the people above them start making deals?" Barlow's hand moved slightly closer to his pistol. "What happens? They become liabilities, the kind that need to disappear." For a moment, the saloon was absolutely silent. Mara could hear her own heartbeat, steady and sure. She could hear Barlow's breathing, heavier now than it had been a moment ago, and she could hear, faintly, the creak of floorboards somewhere at the back of the building, Thorne and his men moving into position. "You've changed," Barlow said finally, something like surprise in his voice. "That scared little girl on the auction block. She's gone. She died that day. The woman standing in front of you now is someone different." Barlow leaned back in his chair, studying her with new interest. "You know, I could have kept you for myself. When we were planning the auction, I thought about it. Thought about what it would be like to break you, to make you mine." His tongue darted across his lips. "I decided against it. Too much trouble, I figured. Easier to sell you off and be done with it." Mara's jaw tightened, but she kept her voice level. "Is that supposed to make me grateful?" "It's supposed to make you understand something." He sat forward suddenly, his eyes burning with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "I could have done anything to you, anything, and nobody would have stopped me. Your father was dead. Your ranch was gone. You had nothing and no one." His voice dropped to a whisper. "I held your entire life in my hands, Mara. I was your god." "And now?" Barlow's hand closed around the grip of his pistol. "Now I'm going to finish what I started." He was fast, faster than she had expected. The gun came up in a blur of motion, the barrel swinging toward her chest. But Mara was faster. She had drawn while he was still talking, her pistol rising from her holster in a smooth arc that ended with the barrel pointed directly at his face. Her finger squeezed the trigger before his gun had even cleared the table. The shot echoed through the saloon like a thunderclap. Barlow's chair tipped backward. He hit the floor hard, his pistol clattering from his hand, a red stain spreading across his right shoulder. He screamed, a high, animal sound of shock and pain, and tried to crawl toward his fallen weapon. Mara crossed the distance between them in 3 steps. Her boot came down on his outstretched hand, pinning it to the floor inches from the pistol's grip. "You were saying something about being my god," she said, her voice cold as winter ice. "How's that working out for you?" Barlow looked up at her, his face twisted with agony and disbelief. You shot me." "I did, and I'll do it again if you move." She pressed her boot down harder, feeling the bones in his hand grind together. "Now we're going to have a conversation, and you're going to tell me everything. Everyone involved in my father's murder, everyone who profited from his death, every detail of how you've been stealing land and lives for the past 20 years. Go to hell." Mara lowered her pistol and shot him in the leg. This scream was louder than the first, a shriek of pure anguish that echoed off the walls and made the lanterns flicker. Barlow writhed on the floor, blood pooling beneath him, his face gone white with shock. "I have 5 more bullets," Mara said calmly, "and a lot of questions. We can do this the easy way, or we can do it the way you taught me, one piece at a time." The saloon doors burst open behind her. Thorne came through first, his rifle raised, followed by Thornton and half a dozen of McCready's men. They spread out through the room, covering the exits, but Mara didn't take her eyes off Barlow. "Mara," Thorne's voice was careful, controlled. "It's over. We've got him." "Not yet." She kept her pistol trained on the sheriff's bloody form. "He hasn't answered my questions." "He will, but not like this." Thorne moved closer, stepping into her peripheral vision. "There are laws, Mara. Courts. Due process. If we kill him here, we're no better than he is." "I'm not going to kill him." Her finger tightened on the trigger, just slightly. "I'm going to hurt him, the way he hurt me, the way he hurt my father, the way he's hurt everyone who ever stood in his way. And then what? You think that's going to bring Thomas back? You think it's going to undo what was done to you on that platform?" Thorne's voice softened, and she could hear the pain in it. Pain for her, fear of what she might become. "Mara, please, put the gun down." For a long moment, she didn't move. The rage inside her was a living thing, a fire that had been burning since the day they dragged her from her father's grave. It demanded blood. It demanded justice. It demanded that Vernon Barlow suffer the way she had suffered, that he know even a fraction of the terror and humiliation he had inflicted on her. But Thorne's words cut through the flames like a cold wind. "We're no better than he is." Is that what she wanted? To become the thing she hated? To let Barlow's cruelty transform her into a monster capable of the same atrocities? Her father wouldn't have wanted that. Thomas Ellington had been a man of principle, a man who believed in justice even when justice seemed impossible. He had taught her to stand up for what was right, but he had also taught her that there were lines you didn't cross, boundaries you didn't break, even when every instinct screamed at you to let go and give in to the darkness. Slowly, painfully, Mara lowered her pistol. "Get him out of here," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper, "before I change my mind." Thornton's men moved forward, hauling Barlow to his feet despite his screams of protest. They half carried, half dragged him toward the door, leaving a trail of blood across the sawdust floor. Mara watched them go, her body trembling with emotions she couldn't name. And then Thorne was there, his arms wrapping around her, pulling her close against his chest. She buried her face in his shoulder and let the tears come. Not tears of grief this time, but tears of release, of catharsis, of something very much like relief. "It's over," he murmured into her hair. "It's finally over." But it wasn't. Not quite. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of activity. Federal marshals arrived from Santa Fe, accompanied by a contingent of territorial officials who had not been corrupted by Judge Whitmore's influence. They took custody of Barlow and his surviving men, securing them in the Santo Vega jail until they could be transported to the capital for trial. Mara gave her statement to a grim-faced prosecutor named Harrison, recounting everything that had happened, The auction, the flight to Red Bluff, the raid on her father's ranch, the battle at the logging camp. She spoke for hours, her voice growing hoarse, while Harrison took notes and asked questions and occasionally shook his head in disbelief at the depths of corruption she was describing. "This will be the biggest trial in territorial history," he said when she had finished. "Every newspaper in the country will cover it. You'll be called as a witness, you and Marshal Thorne and everyone else who was involved." "I'll be there," Mara promised, "whatever it takes to see them all put away." But even as she said the words, part of her mind was already moving on, thinking about what came next. The immediate crisis had passed. The villains had been captured. Justice, real justice, was finally within reach. So why did she feel so empty? She found Thorne on the porch of the hotel, where they had taken rooms, sitting in a worn wooden chair and watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. His wound had been properly treated by one of the army doctors, and though he moved stiffly, the color had returned to his face. "Mind if I join you?" she asked. He gestured to the chair beside him. "Please." She sat, folding her hands in her lap, watching the same sunset he was watching, but seeing something entirely different. "I've been thinking about what you said," she told him after a long silence. "In Red Bluff, about walking the same path together." Thorne turned to look at her, his pale eyes catching the dying light. And I realized something, standing in that saloon with my gun pointed at Barlow's head." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I realized that I could have pulled the trigger. Part of me wanted to, desperately. But I didn't, because of you. Because you were there, reminding me who I want to be." "Mara, let me finish." She drew a shaky breath. "My whole life I've been defined by other people. My father's daughter, the girl on the auction block, the victim, the survivor. I never got to choose who I was. It was always chosen for me." She turned to face him, and there were tears glistening in her eyes. "But now, for the first time, I get to decide. And I'm choosing you, Gage. Not because you saved me, not because I owe you, because when I'm with you, I'm the person I want to be." Thorne was silent for a long moment. The sunset deepened around them, shadows stretching across the dusty street as the sun slipped below the horizon. Then he reached out and took her hand. "I'm not an easy man to live with," he said quietly. "I've got ghosts, lots of them. Scars that don't show on the outside, but still ache when the weather changes. I wake up some nights reaching for a gun that isn't there, fighting battles that ended years ago. I have ghosts too." "I know." His grip tightened on her fingers. "That's why I think we might just work. Two broken people putting each other back together." A smile ghosted across his weathered face. "Sounds almost romantic when you say it like that." Despite everything, the trauma, the exhaustion, the weight of all that had happened, Mara felt herself smile in return. "So what now?" she asked. "Now?" Thorne looked out at the darkening desert, at the stars beginning to appear in the indigo sky. "Now we finish what we started. We go to Santa Fe. We testify. We make sure Whitmore and Barlow and everyone else involved pays for what they did." He paused. And then? He turned back to her, and there was something in his eyes she had never seen before. Something vulnerable and hopeful and almost afraid. "And then I'd like to ask you a question, but I think it should wait until this is truly over, until the trials are done and the bad men are locked away and we have time to breathe." His thumb traced circles on the back of her hand. "Is that all right?" Mara's heart was pounding. She had a feeling she knew what question he wanted to ask, and she had a feeling she knew what her answer would be. "That's all right," she said softly. They sat together in the gathering darkness, watching the stars emerge one by one, finding comfort in each other's presence, even as the world around them continued to turn. The news from Santa Fe came 3 days later. Judge Harold Whitmore had been arrested in his home, dragged from his bed in the middle of the night by federal marshals who found him trying to burn documents in his fireplace. He had attempted to bribe his way out, offering money, property, even his own brother's testimony against other corrupt officials. But the evidence from Thomas Ellington's hidden room was too damning to ignore. Within a week, a dozen more arrests had been made. Bankers, politicians, lawmen, The web of corruption that had strangled the territory for 2 decades was being torn apart, thread by thread. Newspapers across the country ran stories about the massive conspiracy, and public outrage demanded swift and severe justice. Mara followed the news obsessively, reading every report, tracking every development. Part of her still couldn't believe it was happening, that the machine that had destroyed her father and tried to destroy her was actually being dismantled. But another part of her was already looking ahead, already planning for the future that was finally within reach. The prosecutor says the trials will start in 3 months, she told Thorne one evening as they walked along the main street of Santo Vega. The town had transformed in the weeks since Barlow's capture. The fear that had hung over it like a shroud was lifting, replaced by something that almost felt like hope. He wants us in Santa Fe by then to prepare our testimony. 3 months. Thorne nodded slowly. That gives us time. Time for what? He didn't answer immediately. They had reached the edge of town where the buildings gave way to the open desert and the sky stretched out before them in an endless canvas of stars. I've been thinking about what comes after, he said finally, after the trials, after everything is settled. And? My term as Marshal ends next spring. I could renew it, keep doing what I've been doing, or... He trailed off, his jaw tightening. Or... Thorne turned to face her, and in the starlight, his weathered face looked almost young. Or I could retire, buy some land somewhere quiet, maybe near Red Bluff, maybe somewhere new. Build a life that doesn't involve chasing outlaws and sleeping with one eye open. He reached out and took both her hands in his. Build a life with you, if you'll have me. Mara's breath caught. Gage, I know I said I'd wait until this was over. I know the trials haven't even started yet, but I can't. His voice cracked slightly, and he had to stop and gather himself before continuing. I can't keep pretending that I don't know what I want. I want you, Mara. I want to wake up beside you every morning and fall asleep next to you every night. I want to build something together, something good and real and lasting. Are you asking me to marry you? The words hung in the air between them, fragile and momentous. I'm asking you to think about it, Thorne said. I'm asking you to consider whether, when all of this is done, you might want to... She kissed him. It was different from the kisses they had shared before, not desperate or frightened or tinged with the uncertainty of survival. This was a kiss of acceptance, of promise, of two souls finally finding their way home to each other. When they pulled apart, both of them were breathing hard. Is that a yes? Thorne managed. That's a yes, but not yet. Mara smiled, her eyes bright with happy tears. I want to say yes, more than anything. But you were right. We need to finish this first. We need to see it through to the end. Make sure Barlow and Whitmore and all the rest of them are locked away for good. She reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the scar that ran from his temple to his jaw. And then, when the dust has settled and we can finally breathe, ask me again. Thorne's smile was like sunrise after a long, dark night. I can wait, he said. For you, I can wait forever. They returned to Santo Vega as midnight approached. The town was quiet, most of its residents asleep behind closed doors and shuttered windows. But as they passed the Silver Spur Saloon, still dark and empty since the night of Barlow's capture, Mara paused. What is it? Thorne asked. She stared at the building, remembering the last time she had stood here. The auction block had been right out front, where the hitching posts now stood empty. She could still feel the rope around her wrists, still hear the shouted bids, still see the leering faces of the men who had treated her like property. But the fear that had accompanied those memories was fading. In its place was something else, something stronger. I used to have nightmares about this place, she said quietly. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back on that platform. Helpless, hopeless, waiting for someone to save me. And now? Mara turned to look at him, and her expression was calm, resolved, at peace. Now I know the truth. I didn't need someone to save me, Gage. I needed someone to remind me that I was worth saving. She took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. You gave me that, and I'll spend the rest of my life being grateful. They walked back to the hotel in comfortable silence, two figures moving through the darkness with the easy rhythm of people who had found their place in the world. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent and eternal. But for once their cold light didn't feel lonely. It felt like possibility. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Mara was eating breakfast in the hotel dining room when the door opened and a group of women walked in. A dozen of them, maybe more, ranging in age from barely 20 to well past 60. They approached her table with nervous determination, their faces a mixture of hope and apprehension. "Miss Ellington?" The speaker was a middle-aged woman with steel gray hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. "My name is Margaret Holloway. We—" She gestured at the women behind her. "We wanted to thank you." Mara set down her fork, confused. "Thank me? For what?" "For what you did." Margaret's voice grew stronger. "For standing up to Barlow and his men, for bringing justice to this territory." She glanced at her companions, drawing courage from their presence. "Every woman in this room has lost something to the corruption you helped destroy. Husbands, fathers, brothers, sons. Some of us lost our land. Some of us lost our savings. Some of us lost—" She trailed off, unable to finish. "Some of us lost our dignity," another woman said softly. "The way you almost did." Mara's throat tightened. She hadn't thought about this, hadn't considered that her struggle might resonate with others who had suffered at Barlow's hands. "I didn't do it alone," she said. "Marshal Thorne, Marshal Thornton, the men from the logging camp, they risked everything to help me." "But you started it." Margaret stepped forward, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "You could have run. You could have hidden. You could have accepted your fate and tried to survive the best you could. But you didn't. You fought back. And because you did, the rest of us finally have hope." The women gathered around her table, each one offering words of gratitude, sharing stories of their own losses and their own small acts of resistance against the tyranny that had gripped the territory for so long. Mara listened to them all, holding their hands, meeting their eyes, trying to absorb the enormity of what she was hearing. She had thought of her mission as personal, a daughter's quest to avenge her father and reclaim her stolen life. She hadn't realized that it was also something larger, something that touched the lives of countless others who had suffered in silence. "What will you do now?" Margaret asked, when the stories had been shared and the tears had been dried. Mara thought about the question. She thought about Thorne's proposal, about the future they were beginning to imagine together. She thought about the trials that were coming, the testimony she would give, the justice that was finally within reach. And she thought about these women, these survivors, who had found the courage to step forward because she had stepped forward first. "I'm going to finish what I started," she said. "I'm going to make sure that everyone responsible for this nightmare is held accountable." And then she smiled, a genuine smile that felt strange on her face after so many weeks of tension and fear. "And then I'm going to build a new life, a good life, a life that my father would have been proud of." Margaret reached out and squeezed her hand. "If you ever need anything, anything at all, you know where to find us." After the women had gone, Mara sat alone in the dining room, staring at the empty plates and cold coffee. She felt different somehow, changed in a way she couldn't quite define. The weight that had been pressing down on her shoulders for so long had shifted, transformed into something else. Not lighter, exactly, but more bearable. Thorne found her there an hour later, still lost in thought. "I heard about your visitors," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "Word is spreading. People are calling you a hero." "I'm not a hero. Tell that to the women who came to thank you this morning." He reached across the table and took her hand. "You may not see yourself that way, Mara, but they do. And so do I." She looked at him, this scarred, weathered lawman who had given up everything to save her, and felt something warm bloom in her chest. "We should start packing," she said. "The trials are in 3 months, but we have a lot of ground to cover between now and then. Actually, there's something I need to do first." "What?" Thorne's expression grew serious. "I need to go back to Red Bluff, just for a few days. There are things I need to settle there, loose ends to tie up, arrangements to make." He hesitated. "I could wait until after the trials, but you'd rather do it now." "I'd rather do it before I ask you that question again." His eyes held hers, steady and sure. "I want to come to you with everything in order, no baggage, no complications, just me, asking you to share my life." Mara felt her heart swell with a love so fierce it almost hurt. "Go," she said. "Do what you need to do. I'll be here when you get back." He left the next morning, riding north toward Red Bluff with the sunrise at his back. Mara stood on the hotel porch and watched him go, feeling the distance grow between them with each passing moment. But it didn't feel like loss. It felt like an intermission, a brief pause before the next act of a story that was only beginning to unfold. She turned back to the hotel, already making plans for the days ahead. There was work to be done, testimony to prepare, a future to build, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she was looking forward to all of it. The waiting was harder than she had expected. 5 days passed, then 6, then 7. Mara threw herself into preparation for the trials, working with Prosecutor Harrison to organize the evidence and refine her testimony. She met with Thornton, who was coordinating the federal response from a temporary office in Santo Vega. She even returned to her father's ranch, now secured by the territorial government, to walk through the rooms where she had grown up and make peace with the ghosts that lingered there. But every night, as she lay alone in her hotel room, she found herself listening for the sound of hoofbeats that didn't come. On the 8th day, a rider arrived from Red Bluff. It was Billy, Thorne's young deputy, and his face was pale with exhaustion and something else, something that made Mara's blood run cold. "Miss Ellington." He dismounted in a rush, nearly stumbling over his own feet. "You need to come. Right now." "What happened? Is Gage—" "He's alive." Billy's voice cracked. "But there's trouble. Bad trouble. Some of Barlow's men, the ones who escaped before the cavalry arrived, they tracked the Marshal back to Red Bluff. They what?" Billy couldn't meet her eyes. "They're holding the town hostage. They've got the Marshal locked up in his own jail. They say if anyone tries to rescue him, they'll burn Red Bluff to the ground." Mara's world tilted. For a moment she couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but stand there as the implications crashed over her like a wave. Then the shock gave way to something else, something hot and fierce and absolutely unstoppable. "How many men do you have?" she asked, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her heart. "Just me. The other deputies are prisoners too." "Then we gather more." She turned on her heel and strode toward the livery stable where her mare was housed. "Thornton has men, McCready has men. We'll ride to Red Bluff with an army if we have to, and we'll tear those bastards apart." "Miss Ellington?" She spun to face him, and whatever he saw in her expression made him take a step backward. "They have the man I love," she said, each word dropping like a stone into still water. "They have him locked in a cage and they're threatening to kill him if anyone interferes. Do you really think I'm going to sit here and wait for someone else to save him?" Billy swallowed hard. "No, ma'am." "Good. Now help me saddle my horse." Within 2 hours, they were riding north at a punishing pace. Mara, Billy, Thornton, and 30 volunteers from Santo Vega who had heard about the situation and refused to stand by while their hero was held hostage. They pushed their horses to the limit, stopping only when absolutely necessary, driven by the knowledge that every passing hour brought Thorne closer to death. Mara rode at the front, her jaw set with determination, her eyes fixed on the horizon. She thought about the night Thorne had walked into the Silver Spur Saloon and bought her freedom with everything he had. She thought about the campfires they had shared, the conversations that had peeled away the layers of their armor and revealed the wounded souls beneath. She thought about the kiss in her hotel room, the promise in his eyes, the future they had been so close to grasping, and she thought about what she would do to the men who had taken him from her. The answer came easily, burning bright in the darkness of her mind. Whatever it takes. They reached Red Bluff as the sun was setting on the second day of riding. The town looked peaceful from a distance. Streets quiet, buildings intact. No sign of the violence that lurked within. But as they drew closer, Mara could see the truth. Armed men patrolled the streets in pairs, their rifles held ready. The shops and homes were shuttered, their windows dark. And in the center of town, near the Marshal's office, a makeshift gallows had been constructed, a wooden platform with a noose swinging gently in the evening breeze. "Dear God," Thornton breathed. Mara didn't speak. She was too busy counting the enemy forces, assessing the layout, searching for any advantage they might exploit. "There's a back way into town," Billy said, his voice low. "Through the canyons to the east. It comes out near the livery stable." Too narrow. Mara shook her head. We'd have to go single file, and they'd pick us off as we emerged. Then what do we do? She stared at the town, at the gallows, at the armed men, at the jail where Thorn was being held, and slowly a plan began to form in her mind. We give them what they want, she said. Which is? Me. Mara turned to face the others, her expression calm despite the fear churning in her stomach. Barlow's men don't care about Red Bluff. They don't care about holding hostages or making demands. They want revenge. Revenge for what I did to their boss, for the men they lost at the logging camp, for the whole operation falling apart. She paused, letting the words sink in. If I walk in there alone and offer myself in exchange for the hostages, they'll take the deal. That's suicide, Thornton said flatly. No, it's a distraction. Mara's eyes glittered with cold purpose. While I'm keeping them busy, you take your men around through the canyons. Billy knows the way. It'll be slow, but if you time it right, you'll emerge behind their defensive line. When the shooting starts, they won't know which way to turn. And what about you? I'll be in the middle of it, exactly where I need to be. Thornton stared at her for a long moment. Then slowly, he nodded. You're either the bravest woman I've ever met, he said, or the craziest. Can't I be both? She dismounted and handed her reins to Billy. Then she reached into her saddlebag and pulled out the pistol Thorn had given her, the same one she had used to shoot Barlow in that Santo Vega saloon. Wait for my signal, she said. What signal? Mara smiled, a fierce, dangerous smile that would have made her father proud. You'll know it when you hear it. And then she walked toward the town, alone, into the gathering darkness. The main street of Red Bluff stretched before her like a gauntlet, each step taking her deeper into enemy territory. Mara kept her hands visible at her sides, her pistol tucked into the back of her waistband where it couldn't be seen. The evening air was cool against her skin, carrying the scent of wood smoke and dust, and something else underneath, the acrid tang of fear. She had walked about 50 yards when the first guard spotted her. Hold it right there! A man stepped out from behind a water trough, his rifle trained on her chest. He was young, barely older than Billy, with a scraggly beard and nervous eyes. Who are you? What do you want? My name is Mara Ellington. She kept her voice calm, projecting confidence she didn't entirely feel. I'm here to speak with whoever's in charge. The guard's eyes widened with recognition. Ellington? The woman who shot your boss, yes. Mara allowed herself a small, cold smile. I imagine your friends have been talking about me. The young man's rifle wavered. He glanced over his shoulder, clearly uncertain what to do with this unexpected development. Before he could make a decision, another figure emerged from the shadows, an older man with a scarred face and the dead eyes of someone who had long since stopped caring about right and wrong. Well, well. The scarred man approached slowly, his hand resting on the butt of his holstered pistol. Mara Ellington, we were wondering when you'd show up. Here I am. Now take me to your leader. The scarred man laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. You've got nerve, I'll give you that. Walking in here like you own the place. He gestured with his pistol. Start moving, and if you try anything clever, I'll put a bullet in your spine. They marched her down the main street, past shuttered windows and locked doors. Mara could feel eyes watching her from the darkness, townspeople peering through cracks in their curtains, witnesses to whatever was about to unfold. She wondered how many of them recognized her, how many knew why she was here and what she was risking. The marshal's office sat at the center of town, a sturdy stone building with barred windows and a heavy wooden door. 2 more guards flanked the entrance, and through the front window Mara could see lamplight flickering inside. The scarred man pushed her through the door. The office was exactly as she remembered from Thorne's descriptions. A functional space with a desk, a gun rack, a pot-bellied stove, and a row of cells along the back wall. The cells were full now. Townspeople crowded together behind the bars, their faces pale with fear and exhaustion. And in the last cell, separated from the others, was Gage Thorne. He looked terrible. His face was bruised, his shirt torn and blood-stained, and his hands were bound behind his back. But when he saw her walk through the door, his eyes went wide with a mixture of hope and horror. Mara, what are you— Quiet! The man sitting behind the desk rose to his feet, and Mara recognized him immediately. Cornelius Drake, the mining magnate who had bid on her at the auction, the man who, according to the documents they had recovered, was one of Judge Whitmore's primary financial backers. He should have been in custody with the others, should have been locked in a Santa Fe jail cell awaiting trial. But here he was, standing in the marshal's office of Red Bluff, with a satisfied smile spreading across his thin lips. "Miss Ellington?" Drake's voice was smooth, cultured, the voice of a man who had always had others do his dirty work for him. "I was hoping we'd have a chance to finish our business. How did you escape?" "Escape?" Drake laughed softly. "My dear, I was never captured. While Whitmore and Barlow were blundering about, drawing attention to themselves, I was quietly liquidating my assets and preparing for contingencies." He gestured at the armed men surrounding them. "These gentlemen are mercenaries, professionals, unlike the rabble Barlow employed. They don't ask questions. They simply do what they're paid to do." "And what are they being paid to do?" Drake's smile widened. "Originally, retrieve certain documents that I was told you had in your possession, documents that could prove inconvenient for my future business endeavors." He paused, his eyes traveling over her with an appraising look that made her skin crawl. "But now that you've delivered yourself directly into my hands, I find myself reconsidering my priorities." "Let the hostages go." Mara's voice was steady, but her heart was pounding. "Let them go, and I'll cooperate. I'll tell you where the documents are. I'll do whatever you want." "How very noble." Drake moved closer, close enough that she could smell his expensive cologne. "But I'm afraid it's not that simple. You've caused me a great deal of trouble, Miss Ellington. Millions of dollars in lost investments, business partnerships destroyed, my reputation in certain circles irreparably damaged." His voice hardened. "There has to be a reckoning. Then take it out on me, not on these people. They've done nothing to you." "No, they haven't, but Marshal Thorne has." Drake glanced toward the cell where Thorne was watching with murder in his eyes. "He killed 6 of my men at the logging camp, cost me a small fortune in recruitment and training." He turned back to Mara. "I was planning to hang him tomorrow morning, a public execution, to remind the citizens of Red Bluff what happens when people interfere with my affairs." Mara felt her blood run cold. "You can't. I can do whatever I want." Drake's mask of civility slipped, revealing the predator beneath. "I have the guns. I have the men. And now I have you." He reached out and gripped her chin, forcing her to meet his gaze. "The question is, what am I going to do with you?" Mara stared into his eyes, cold, calculating, utterly devoid of mercy, and knew that there would be no reasoning with this man, no bargaining, no appeal to his better nature, because he didn't have one, which meant it was time for Plan B. "Actually," she said, "I have a better question." "Oh? What are you going to do when 30 armed men come pouring out of the canyons behind your defensive line?" Drake's grip on her chin loosened. "What are you talking about? Did you really think I walked in here alone?" Mara smiled, a cold, fierce smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm the distraction, Mr. Drake. While you've been busy gloating, Federal Marshal Thornton has been leading a rescue party through the eastern passes. They should be in position right about—" A gunshot cracked through the night air, followed by another, and then the staccato roar of a full-fledged firefight. Now! Everything happened at once. Mara yanked free of Drake's grip and threw herself to the side, her hand reaching for the pistol at her back. The scarred mercenary lunged for her, but she was faster. The gun came up and she fired in one smooth motion, the bullet catching him in the chest and sending him sprawling backward into the desk. Drake was scrambling for cover, shouting orders to his remaining men. "Kill her! Kill them all!" But his men were in disarray, caught between the assault from outside and the threat inside. Mara dropped 2 more before they could bring their weapons to bear, then dove behind the pot-bellied stove as return fire shredded the air above her head. "Thorne!" She popped up long enough to fire another shot, then dropped back down. "Can you get free?" "Working on it!" His voice was strained but determined. Outside, the sounds of battle intensified. Mara could hear Thornton shouting commands, could hear the thunder of hooves and the crack of rifles. Drake's mercenaries were caught in a crossfire, their carefully planned defenses crumbling under the weight of the unexpected assault. But inside the office, the situation remained desperate. Two guards had taken up positions near the cells, using the captive townspeople as human shields. Drake himself had retreated to the far corner of the room, a small pistol clutched in his manicured hands. And between Mara and Thorne's cell, 4 more mercenaries were pouring fire in her direction. She was pinned down, outnumbered, running low on ammunition, and she had never felt more alive. "Miss Ellington," Drake's voice rose above the chaos. "You can't win this. Surrender now and I'll make it quick, for you and for your precious Marshal." "Counteroffer," Mara shouted back. You surrender and I'll make sure you live long enough to stand trial." Drake laughed, a high, unhinged sound. "You're in no position to tss." The front door exploded inward. Thornton came through first, his rifle blazing. Behind him came McCready's loggers, Billy, and a dozen townspeople who had slipped away from their captors in the confusion and armed themselves with whatever they could find. The mercenaries never stood a chance. The firefight was brutal but brief. Within minutes, Drake's men were dead or surrendering, their professional discipline no match for the fury of people fighting for their homes and their lives. But Drake himself had disappeared. Mara spotted the side door swinging open and knew, with a certainty that settled in her bones like cold iron, where he had gone. She ran. The alley behind the marshal's office was dark and narrow, choked with debris and shadow. She could hear footsteps ahead, Drake fleeing toward the livery stable where fresh horses waited. She couldn't let him escape. If he got away, if he managed to reach the border or slip onto a ship bound for some distant port, all of this would have been for nothing. He would rebuild. He would plan. And someday, when she least expected it, he would come for her again. Not today. Not ever again. She burst out of the alley and into the open ground behind the livery. Drake was there, struggling to mount a skittish horse that wanted nothing to do with the sounds of gunfire echoing through the town. "Drake!" He spun, his pistol coming up. Mara fired first. The bullet caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing to the ground. His pistol went flying, disappearing into the darkness beyond the reach of the lamplight. Mara approached slowly, her weapon trained on his prone form. "It's over," she said. "Your men are dead or captured. Your money won't buy you out of this, and tomorrow you'll be on your way to Santa Fe in chains." Drake looked up at her, his face contorted with pain and rage. "You think this ends anything? There are others, men more powerful than me, with longer memories and deeper pockets. They'll never stop hunting you. Never." "Maybe." Mara crouched down until she was eye level with him. "But they'll have to go through me. And after tonight, everyone in this territory knows what happens when someone tries." She leaned closer. "I was sold like livestock on an auction block. I watched my father murdered for his land. I was beaten, humiliated, stripped of everything that made me human. And I'm still standing." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "What makes you think anyone else can finish what you started?" Drake had no answer. Thornton's men arrived moments later to take him into custody. Mara stood back and watched as they dragged him away, feeling the last of the adrenaline drain from her body. It was over, finally, truly over. She made her way back to the marshal's office in a daze. The townspeople were emerging from the cells, embracing each other, crying with relief. The wounded were being tended to by Doc Harrison's Red Bluff counterpart. And there, standing in the middle of the chaos with rope burns on his wrists and blood on his face, was Gage Thorne. He saw her at the same moment she saw him. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. They crossed the distance between them in 3 quick strides and fell into each other's arms, holding on as if they would never let go. "You came for me," he murmured into her hair. "Of course I did." Her voice was muffled against his chest. "Did you think I was going to let those bastards hang you?" The thought crossed my mind. She pulled back just far enough to meet his eyes. "Never. You hear me? I will never stop fighting for you, not as long as I'm breathing." Thorne's hands came up to cup her face, his thumbs brushing away the tears she hadn't realized she was crying. "I love you," he said. The words hung in the air between them, simple and profound and absolutely true. "I love you too," Mara whispered. And then she kissed him, right there in the middle of the chaos, with the whole town watching and the flames of the dying battle still flickering in the distance. She kissed him like her life depended on it, like he was the air she needed to breathe, like nothing else in the world mattered except the two of them, and this moment, and the future, stretching out before them. When they finally broke apart, Thornton was standing nearby with an amused expression on his weathered face. "Sorry to interrupt," he said dryly, "but we've got prisoners to process and wounded to tend to, and about 100 other things that need doing." "Later," Mara said, not taking her eyes off Thorn. "Much later," Thorn agreed. Thornton sighed. "Young love, fine, take the night. But tomorrow, we've got work to do." The trials began 2 months later in Santa Fe. Mara testified for 3 days straight, recounting every detail of her ordeal: the auction, the flight from Santo Vega, the raid on her father's ranch, the battles and betrayals and narrow escapes. She spoke clearly and calmly, her voice never wavering, her eyes meeting those of the jurors with a steadiness that commanded respect. Thorn testified as well, as did Thornton and McCready and dozens of others who had witnessed the conspiracy firsthand. The evidence was overwhelming. Thomas Ellington's documents, Drake's financial records, the sworn statements of turncoats who had decided to cooperate in exchange for lighter sentences. Judge Whitmore was convicted of 17 counts of fraud, extortion, and conspiracy to commit murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Sheriff Vernon Barlow was convicted of 32 counts, including the murder of Thomas Ellington. He was sentenced to hang, and the sentence was carried out on a gray November morning in the Santa Fe courtyard. Mara didn't attend the execution. She had no desire to watch Barlow die. Justice had been served. That was enough. Cornelius Drake was convicted on 15 counts and sentenced to 40 years. He would die in prison, old and forgotten, stripped of the wealth and power that had once made him untouchable. And when it was all over, when the verdicts had been read and the sentences had been passed and the newspapers had printed their final headlines, Mara walked out of the Santa Fe courthouse into the bright winter sunshine and found Gage Thorne waiting for her. "It's done," she said. "It's done." They stood there for a moment, blinking in the light, trying to process the enormity of what they had accomplished. The battle that had consumed their lives for so many months was finally over. The enemies who had threatened to destroy them were defeated. And the future, that uncertain, terrifying, beautiful future, was finally theirs to claim. "So," Thorne said, a hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth, "I believe I owe you a question." Mara's heart began to race. "I believe you do." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. When he opened it, the diamond inside caught the sunlight and scattered it into 1,000 tiny rainbows. "Mara Ellington," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion shimmering in his pale eyes, "I have loved you since the moment I saw you fighting for your dignity on that auction block. I have loved you through gunfights and chases and battles that should have killed us both. And I will love you for every day of whatever time we have left on this earth." He paused, his throat working. "Will you marry me?" Mara looked at the ring, looked at the man holding it, looked at the life stretching out before her, a life she had never dared to imagine, a life built on love and courage and the unshakable knowledge that she was finally, truly free. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'll marry you, 1,000 times yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her, as if it had been waiting all along. And then they kissed there on the courthouse steps, with the winter sun warming their faces and the citizens of Santa Fe applauding around them. They kissed like two people who had walked through fire and come out the other side. They kissed like survivors, like victors, like partners who would face whatever came next together, hand in hand, for the rest of their lives. The wedding took place in Red Bluff on a warm spring afternoon when the wildflowers were blooming in the mountain meadows and the air smelled of sagebrush and possibility. It was a simple ceremony, just Mara and Thornton as best man, and Margaret Holloway, who had become a dear friend in the months since their first meeting, as matron of honor. The townspeople gathered to witness the union, their faces bright with joy and celebration. Doc Harrison performed the ceremony, his silver hair gleaming in the sunlight. When he pronounced them husband and wife, a cheer went up from the crowd that echoed off the surrounding mountains. The reception was held in the meadow behind Thorne's office, which was no longer his office, because he had retired from the Marshal service just as he'd promised. Tables were laden with food and drink, musicians played lively tunes, and children ran laughing through the wildflowers while their parents danced. Mara stood at the edge of the celebration, watching her new husband share a toast with Thornton and Macready. She still couldn't quite believe it. This life, this happiness, this peace that had seemed so impossibly out of reach just a year ago. "Mrs. Thorne!" She turned to find Billy standing beside her, his young face split with a grin. "Congratulations," he said. "You deserve this. Both of you." "Thank you, Billy." She reached out and squeezed his shoulder. "And thank you for writing to Santo Vega to warn me about the hostage situation. If you hadn't, don't even think about it." His grin faded into something more serious. "I was just doing my job. You and the Marshal, you showed me what it means to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard, even when it costs you everything." He straightened his shoulders. "I'm going to be the Marshal of Red Bluff someday, and when I am, I'm going to make you proud." Mara felt tears prick at her eyes. "You already have." Later, as the sun began to set and the celebration wound down, Mara and Thorne slipped away from the crowd. They walked hand in hand through the meadow, past the wildflowers and the dancing fireflies, to the overlook where Thorne had first brought her all those months ago. The valley of Red Bluff spread out below them, painted in shades of gold and rose by the setting sun. Beyond it, the desert stretched to the horizon, endless and ancient and full of mystery. "I've been thinking about something," Mara said. "What's that?" "The double star, my father's ranch." She paused, watching a hawk circle lazily in the evening sky. "The territorial government has been holding it in trust, waiting for the trials to end. Now that everything is settled, they've offered to return it to me." Thorne turned to look at her. And I've decided to sell it." She met his eyes. "That place has too many ghosts, too many memories of what I lost. I don't want to live in the shadow of my grief for the rest of my life." "Where do you want to live?" Mara smiled, a genuine smile, full of hope and promise. "I was thinking we could buy some land near here, build a new ranch, something that's ours. Not a monument to the past, but a foundation for the future." Thorne's face softened. "That sounds perfect. There's just one problem." "What's that?" "I don't know anything about building a house." She laughed, the sound bright and free. "I know how to break a horse and brand a steer and shoot a man at 50 paces. But when it comes to carpentry, I'm completely useless." Thorne chuckled. "Well, lucky for you, I spent a summer working construction in Kansas before I fell in with the wrong crowd. I can swing a hammer with the best of them." "Then I guess we make a good team." "I guess we do." He pulled her into his arms, and they stood there together, watching the sun sink below the horizon and the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. The world stretched out before them, vast and wild and full of possibility. They had survived the worst that fate could throw at them. They had faced down corruption and violence and injustice, and they had emerged victorious, and now, finally, they were free to build the life they had always wanted. The construction began that summer. Mara and Thorne chose a plot of land about 5 miles north of Red Bluff, in a shallow valley ringed by mountains. There was a stream running through the property. Good water, Thorne said, clean and cold, and plenty of grazing land for the cattle they planned to raise. They hired workers from the logging camp and the town, men who were eager to help the couple who had freed them from Barlow's tyranny. The work was hard but satisfying, and every day brought them closer to their goal. By autumn, the house was finished, a sturdy structure of stone and timber with a wide porch overlooking the valley and windows that caught the morning sun. It wasn't fancy, but it was solid, built to last for generations. On the day they moved in, Mara stood on the porch and looked out at the land that was now hers. Their land. A new beginning, rising from the ashes of the old. "What are you thinking about?" Thorne came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "I'm thinking about my father," she said softly. "About whether he would be proud of what we've accomplished." "He would be proud of you, Mara, of who you've become." Thorne rested his chin on her shoulder. "You honored his memory by bringing his killers to justice. And now you're honoring his legacy by building something new, something good and lasting. We're building something together." "Yes, we are." She turned in his arms, facing him. "I never thanked you properly, you know." "Thanked me for what?" for buying my freedom, for believing in me when I had stopped believing in myself, for loving me despite everything I'd been through. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. You gave me back my life, Gage, and I will spend the rest of it making sure you never regret it. He kissed her forehead gently. I could never regret anything that led me to you. They stood there together as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of fire and gold. And in that moment, Mara knew that everything she had suffered, the loss, the pain, the humiliation, had led her exactly where she was meant to be. Home. A year later, their first child was born. They named him Thomas, after Mara's father. He had his mother's dark hair and his father's pale gray eyes, and from the moment he drew his first breath, he was the center of their world. Mara held him in her arms, marveling at the miracle of his existence. This tiny person, this perfect combination of her and Thorn, this promise of a future she had never dared to dream. He's beautiful, Thorn said, his voice rough with emotion. He is. Mara looked up at her husband, tears streaming down her face. I never thought I would have this. A family, a home, a life worth living. You've always been worth it, Mara. Always. She leaned against him, their son cradled between them. Outside, the first snow of winter was beginning to fall, blanketing the valley in a soft white silence. It was, she thought, the most perfect moment of her life. And it was only the beginning. The years that followed were not without hardship. There were droughts and blizzards, cattle diseases and market crashes. There were nights when Mara woke screaming from nightmares about the auction block, and days when the weight of her memories seemed too heavy to bear. But through it all, Thorn was there. Her partner, her anchor, her home. They raised Thomas together, teaching him the values that had carried them through the darkest times: courage, integrity, compassion, and the unshakable belief that one person could make a difference. When he was old enough, Mara told him the story of his grandfather, the brave rancher who had died fighting for what he believed in. She told him about the auction, about the rescue, about the long and bloody road to justice, and she told him about the man who had given up everything to save her, who had looked at a broken girl on a platform and seen something worth fighting for. Thomas listened to these stories with wide eyes, absorbing them like seeds absorbing rain. And as he grew, Mara saw echoes of her father in him, the same quiet strength, the same stubborn determination, the same deep and abiding sense of right and wrong. By the time Thomas was 12, the ranch had grown into one of the most successful operations in the territory. They had hired hands and cattle drives and all the trappings of prosperity. But Mara never forgot where she had come from, never lost touch with the hunger and desperation that had once defined her life. She used her wealth to help others, funding schools for poor children, supporting widows and orphans, establishing a network of safe houses for women escaping abusive situations. She became known throughout the territory as a champion of the downtrodden, a voice for those who had no voice of their own. And through it all, Thorn stood beside her, proud, supportive, utterly devoted to the woman who had transformed his life as surely as he had transformed hers. I never dreamed any of this would happen, Mara told him one evening as they sat on their porch watching the sunset. Thomas was playing in the yard, his laughter echoing across the valley. When you cut those ropes in Santo Vega, I thought my life was over. I thought I had nothing left to live for. And now? She reached over and took his hand. Now I have everything. Thorn squeezed her fingers gently. So do I. They sat in comfortable silence, watching their son play in the fading light. The mountains rose around them, ancient and eternal. The stream whispered its endless song, and the sky blazed with colors so beautiful they seemed to come from another world. Mara thought about the journey that had brought her here, the pain, the fear, the loss, the love. She thought about her father, who had died believing in a better world. She thought about her mother, who had taught her that strength was not the absence of fear, but the courage to face it anyway. And she thought about the stranger who had walked into a saloon on a July afternoon and changed everything with 4 simple words. $1,000. That was what he had paid for her freedom, a year's savings, everything he had. But what he had given her was worth so much more than money. He had given her hope when she had none. He had given her love when she had forgotten how to feel it. He had given her a future when she thought she had lost everything. And now, sitting beside him in the golden light of another perfect evening, Mara Thorne, née Ellington, knew that she was finally, completely, irrevocably home. The story of the auction became a legend in the territory, passed down from generation to generation. Children grew up hearing about the brave woman who had stood against corruption and won, about the lawman who had sacrificed everything for love, about the night when Silver Creek stood together against the forces of darkness. But for Mara, it was never just a story. It was her life, messy and painful and beautiful and real. It was the choices she had made and the prices she had paid. It was the scars on her wrists and the fire in her heart and the love that had carried her through the darkest nights. And when she was very old, with grandchildren climbing on her knees and great-grandchildren running through the meadows of the ranch she and Thorne had built together, she would still sometimes think about that moment on the auction block. The moment when all hope seemed lost. The moment when she had looked up and seen a stranger in the doorway. $1,000. 4 words that had changed everything. She would think about it, and she would smile. Because she knew, with the certainty that comes only from a life fully lived, that every moment of suffering had led her exactly where she was meant to be. Home. With her family. With her love. With a heart that had been broken and healed and broken again, but never, ever defeated. On the last night of her life, Mara Thorne lay in her bed, surrounded by generations of family. Gage had passed 5 years earlier, and not a day went by that she didn't miss him. But she knew she would see him again soon. Thomas sat at her bedside, holding her hand. The hand that had once pulled a trigger against injustice, that had built a home from ashes, that had cradled children and comforted the grieving and never stopped reaching out to those in need. "Mother," he said, his voice thick with tears. "Is there anything you need?" Mara smiled, her eyes clear despite the years. "I have everything," she whispered. "I have always had everything, because I had love, because I had family, because I had you." She closed her eyes, and her breathing slowed. And in those final moments she dreamed. She dreamed of a dusty saloon in a forgotten town. She dreamed of rope around her wrists and fire in her veins. She dreamed of a stranger walking through the door, tall and dust-worn, with a badge glinting beneath his coat. She dreamed of the words that had saved her. $1,000. Name's Gage Thorne, and you're free now. Mara Ellington Thorne died with a smile on her face, surrounded by the family she had built and the legacy she had created. She died knowing that she had lived a life worth living, a life of courage and love and unshakable hope. She died free. And in the end, that was all that mattered.